Have you ever felt like the world has turned its back on you? A time when everything you've ever built has collapsed, the people you thought were friends have vanished, and in the end, you're left alone with the ashes of your life. Henry knew that feeling all too well. At 53, he stood alone in his small dinnerth, only legacy left to him by his father. The old wooden tables, a few bent-back chairs, and the scent of meals from a bygone era still lingered in the air. But now, no one came anymore. From a successful businessman with a luxurious mansion and high-society friends, Henry was now just a lonely diner owner, drowning in debt. His wife had left when the money ran out, his friends disappeared when hardship struck. And then, on a night of pouring rain, fate knocked on his diner's door. A young man, drenched and in tattered clothes, with nowhere else to go. Henry might have turned him away, but something in the young man's eyes made him hesitate. That one decision to let him stay the night changed everything. What happened next will make you believe that sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's continue with the story. It was a rainy night, the kind where the drops hammered the pavement as if the sky was furious with the world. The old clock hanging over the diner's counter showed 11:30 p.m. Henry switched off the last light in the dining room, letting the darkness envelop the place. One last look at the empty diner drew a deep sigh from him. The wooden tables, some with worn corners and peeling varnish, were perfectly aligned, as always. But it didn't matter. No one was coming to sit at them. Henry, a man of 53, seemed to carry the full weight of those years in his stooped posture. His hair, once black as coffee, now had more silver strands than dark ones. His well-trimmed mustache couldn't hide the exhaustion on his face. He wore a white shirt that had lost its original brightness and an apron that held years of work. He walked toward the main door, pushing chairs under the tables as he went. The scrape of metal on the floor broke the silence, a sound that had grown louder over the years. Or maybe it was his soul that had become more sensitive to the loneliness. The diner, Emilio's table, was all he had left. His father, Emilio, had built it from the ground up with love and sweat until it became one of the most well-known spots in the neighborhood. But times changed, and so did Henry's fortune. He had trusted partners who promised the world, only to strip him of his wealth with lies and bad deals. Years ago, when he was a successful businessman, life was full of luxuries and friends who celebrated his victories. Now, those same friends didn't even return his calls. The betrayal wasn't the worst part. After losing everything, his wife, Marilyn, had decided to leave him. "I wasn't born to live like this," she had said the last time he saw her, as she packed her things. The door closed behind her with a sharp click that still echoed in his sleepless nights. Since then, Henry lived alone in a small apartment above the diner. It was a tiny space with plaster walls stained by dampness and an old bed that creaked every time he lay down. In his solitude, Mrs. Gable, a woman in her 70s, was one of the few people who still kept him company. She helped him clean the diner in the mornings and sometimes brought him a casserole she made at home. Mrs. Gable saw Henry as a good man who had simply had bad luck. He who gives without expecting anything in return, she would always say while dusting the tables, will eventually receive his reward. Don't lose faith, Henry. Art, the local meat and produce supplier, was another constant figure in his life. Art brought him products weekly, but the debts were already piling up like an impossible weight. Despite his gruff voice and furrowed brow, Art wasn't a cruel man. "Henry, my friend, I've got a family to feed too, but I'll give you more time. Not much, mind you. Pay when you can," he would say, with a mix of firmness and compassion. Henry gave the empty dining room one last look before double-locking the door. Outside, the street was nearly deserted. The few cars that passed did so in a hurry, splashing water from puddles onto the sidewalks. He adjusted the coat that barely protected him from the cold and prepared to climb the stairs to his apartment. But just as he started to move, a soft, almost imperceptible sound caught his attention. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the diner's door. Henry turned, frowning. Who could be there at this hour? He thought about ignoring it, but the knocks came again, this time more insistent. "Who's there?" he asked in a firm voice, cautiously approaching. When he opened the door, he found a young man soaked from head to toe. His dark hair was stuck to his forehead, and his clothes were torn and dirty. He looked like a stray dog seeking shelter. His eyes, however, didn't ask for pity. Instead, they held a mystery, an untold story. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you," the young man murmured, his voice trembling. "I'm just looking for a place to get out of the rain. I have nowhere to go." Henry stood silent for a few seconds. In other times, he would have slammed the door without a second thought. But that gaze reminded him of something, perhaps of himself, of the times when he too felt lost and without a way out. He looked around as if hoping to find an answer on the empty street and finally said, "Come in, but don't touch anything." The young man nodded and entered without another word. Henry closed the door, leaving the rain and cold outside. He didn't know what kind of trouble he was getting into, but something inside him said that this night was not like the others. The diner's main room was almost as cold as the street, but at least it wasn't raining inside. The young man stood still, water dripping from his hair and soaking the floor. Henry watched him suspiciously, arms crossed and brow furrowed. The situation was strange, even for him, who had already seen the worst of life. Who was this kid? A thief? A dangerous drifter? His mind fired off questions without answers. "Over there, in the corner booth," Henry said, pointing to the most remote corner of the room. "You can stay, but only until the rain stops." The young man nodded in silence and walked slowly toward the table. His gait was heavy, as if every step pained his bones. Before sitting down, he pulled an old piece of cloth from his rags and draped it over his shoulders. It was more of a formality than real protection, as the dampness seemed to have soaked through to his soul. Henry watched him from behind the counter, pretending to wipe a glass with a cloth. He didn't trust him. His eyes followed the stranger's every move. Years ago, in his time of abundance, it would have been unthinkable to let someone like that into his diner. But the years had changed him. Poverty had a cruel way of reminding him that anyone could hit rock bottom. "What's your name?" Henry asked, breaking the silence. The young man, who had kept his gaze fixed on the floor, slowly looked up. His dark eyes were deep, like a bottomless well, and though they seemed hardened by life, there was something about them that drew you in. "Jack," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Where are you from?" "The street. Nowhere," the boy replied, dodging the question like someone dodging a stone in the road. Henry clicked his tongue, slightly irritated by the lack of answers. There was something in Jack's attitude that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't the dirt or the torn clothes, it was the silence, the way the young man seemed to carry an invisible weight. "Listen," Henry said firmly, pointing at him with the glass in his hand. "I don't want any trouble. You can stay until it clears up, but if I see you snooping where you shouldn't, I'll throw you out. Got it?" "Thank you," Jack murmured without raising his voice, as if the words cost him effort. The young man huddled at the table, using the old cloth as a blanket. Henry returned to the counter and stood still, watching him out of the corner of his eye. The rain continued to beat against the windows, filling the uncomfortable silence between them. The minutes passed slowly, and the only sound besides the storm was the tick-tock of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, a memory struck Henry. He himself, many years ago, had been in a similar situation. He remembered his father, Don Emilio, allowing strangers to eat at the diner when they didn't have a penny. "You never deny a plate of food to someone who needs it," his father used to say in a firm voice. That generosity was what had made the diner a respected and beloved place in the community. But times had changed, and kindness was no longer enough to keep the doors open. "Are you hungry?" Henry asked suddenly without thinking. Jack, who seemed to have fallen asleep, slowly lifted his head and looked at him, surprised. "No," he replied almost immediately, but the audible growl from his stomach said otherwise. Henry rolled his eyes and walked into the kitchen without a word. He opened the old refrigerator, which vibrated with a constant hum, and took out some leftover chili and cornbread from the day. He heated it up with a touch of oil and prepared a simple plate. As he worked, he remembered the days when he prepared elaborate banquets for dinners with important businessmen and partners. Those days felt so distant, as if they belonged to another life. "Here," Henry said, coming out of the kitchen and leaving the plate in front of Jack. The young man looked at it with surprise, as if he didn't know how to react. "Thank you, really," he finally replied, taking the fork with trembling hands. Henry returned to the counter without a word, but he watched as Jack devoured the food with restrained hunger. In silence, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't pity, it was something deeper, a sense of familiarity. This boy reminded him of someone, perhaps himself in his youth, before life had changed him completely. When Jack finished, he pushed the plate to the center of the table and murmured an almost inaudible, "Thanks." Then he huddled up again, using the cloth as a blanket. Henry watched him for another moment, as if trying to figure him out, and finally turned off the last lights of the diner. "Don't move from there," he said in a low voice, more out of habit than necessity. He slowly climbed the stairs to his apartment, his body heavy and tired, creaking with every step. When he reached his tiny room, he took off his apron and collapsed onto the bed. For some reason, thoughts of Jack wouldn't leave him in peace. What was a young man like him doing wandering the streets? What story did those dark eyes hold? The rain continued to beat on the roof. Henry turned on his side and closed his eyes, trying to drown out the questions echoing in his mind. He didn't know why he had let that stranger in, but something inside him told him that this was no ordinary night. Something had changed. Henry woke with a start. A soft but persistent metallic sound came from downstairs. He blinked several times, still trapped between sleep and reality. The grey light of dawn was filtering timidly through the slats of the old blinds, and the sound persisted, a faint clinking of kitchen utensils. Henry sat up in bed, frowning. His mind wasn't fully awake yet, but then he remembered the stranger from the night before. "That kid," he muttered in a hoarse voice. He jumped out of bed, slipped on his old slippers, and went down the stairs with a mixture of haste and fear. What was Jack doing in the kitchen? Was he stealing something? The thought made him clench his teeth. He didn't want to believe it, but the years had taught him that life always strikes when you least expect it. When he reached the threshold of the diner, Henry stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw left him speechless. The dining room was spotless. The tables, which the night before still had grease stains and accumulated dust, shone as if they were new. The chairs were perfectly aligned, and the floor, which Henry had left sticky after a day's work, was clean and gleaming. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet floated in the warm, inviting air. Henry swallowed and walked slowly toward the kitchen. There, in the middle of that modest and old space, he saw Jack from behind, moving among the pots and utensils with surprising agility. He was wearing a makeshift apron made from the same tattered cloth he had used as a blanket the night before. His torn shirt hung from his shoulders, but something in his posture, in the almost elegant way he moved his hands, didn't match the image of a homeless young man. "What are you doing?" Henry blurted out in a firm voice. Jack spun around, startled. In his hands, he held a small white plate on which rested what appeared to be some kind of dessert. It was simple, yet so delicately presented that it looked like it was from a magazine. A thin layer of golden crust covered what Henry identified as bread pudding, decorated with a perfectly drawn spiral of caramel. "I'm sorry," Jack said nervously, looking down. "I wanted to thank you for letting me stay the night. I didn't touch anything important. I just tidied up a bit and made this." Henry looked at him for a long time, not knowing what to say. The sweet and warm aroma reminded him of something distant, a time when his father used to bake for him as a child. Finally, he took the plate with slightly trembling hands and placed it on the counter. He sat in one of the chairs and looked at the dessert skeptically. "What is this?" he asked in a gruff voice. "It's a simple dessert," Jack replied, drying his hands on the makeshift apron. "I just needed sugar, eggs, and a bit of vanilla. I didn't have much else, but it turned out well." Henry looked up and stared at him. Jack's humble confidence was unnerving. Finally, he took a spoon and dipped the tip into the bread pudding. The caramel broke gently under the pressure of the metal. The first bite was small, but as soon as he tasted it, Henry's eyes widened in surprise. It was delicious. The texture was smooth and creamy, with a perfect balance of sweet and aromatic flavors. For years, he had eaten bland or poor-quality dishes, but this simple dessert seemed to restore his soul. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" Henry asked, not taking his eyes off the young man. Jack seemed to become uncomfortable. The spark in his eyes dimmed slightly. He looked down and rubbed his hands nervously. "I worked in kitchens before, a long time ago," he answered evasively. "Kitchens?" Henry repeated with interest. "Not just anyone can make something like this. Were you a cook?" "Something like that," Jack replied, cutting the conversation short with his silence. The atmosphere in the kitchen became tense. Henry chewed on the information carefully, studying the young man. There was something about him, a dark shadow that followed him wherever he went, that made him avoid any direct questions. But Henry didn't press. He knew how to recognize when someone wasn't ready to talk, because he himself had been like that for years. "This is good," Henry finally said, breaking the silence. "Very good." Jack looked up and smiled slightly, just a hint of a gesture, but enough for Henry to see a bit of light in his eyes. "Thanks," the boy murmured. Henry put the spoon down on the plate and sighed. He had woken up differently that morning, with a dessert on the table and his diner cleaner than it had been in years. He didn't know what to think, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a small spark of hope, like a flame beginning to ignite after years in darkness. He got up from the chair, still somewhat dazed, and glanced at Jack. "Come on, sit down. I'll get you something to eat. You can't be cooking on an empty stomach." Jack smiled, this time more broadly, and nodded. Henry didn't say it out loud, but something inside him told him that this boy hadn't appeared by chance. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story that was yet to be discovered. "What am I going to do with you?" Henry murmured to himself as he looked for something in the fridge. The morning sun barely managed to break through the diner's windows. Henry, still bewildered by what he had experienced, placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of Jack. The young man, now sitting with a straight back and his hands on the table, looked at him cautiously, as if unaccustomed to such gestures. "Eat," Henry said firmly, sitting down next to him with his own steaming cup of coffee. "Nobody works for free here." Jack nodded slowly and began to eat. Henry watched him in silence, studying him like someone looking at a puzzle piece that doesn't fit. There was something in the neat and discreet way the young man handled his fork and knife that didn't match the image of a common drifter. "Where are you from?" Henry finally asked, leaning slightly toward him. Jack paused for a moment, as if deciding what to answer, but in the end he just murmured, "It doesn't matter where I'm from." Henry frowned, irritated by the evasion. "It matters to me," he insisted, though his tone remained calm. "This isn't a charity house, and from the way you cook, you don't seem like someone who's always slept on the street." Jack put his fork down on the plate and looked toward the window. His silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Finally, he answered with a nearly inaudible whisper, "I lost everything." Henry felt those words stir something in his chest. "I lost everything too," he thought, though he didn't say it out loud. The two remained in silence for a few seconds, until Henry got up from the table and walked to the counter, where he began to count the few coins he had in the cash register. The clinking of metal against the counter seemed to fill the empty space between them. "Listen, Jack," he said suddenly without looking at him. "I can't give you much, but if you clear the tables and clean the kitchen, you can stay. You'll eat whatever we have, and you can sleep here in the dining room." Jack looked at him in disbelief, as if those words were too good to be true. "Why?" he finally asked in a low voice. Henry turned to him and looked him in the eyes, tired but sincere. "Because someone did the same for me many years ago, and because I don't like to see second chances go to waste." The young man didn't answer, but Henry saw his hands tremble slightly. It wasn't from the cold, but from something deeper perhaps. Gratitude, perhaps fear. Jack stood up and nodded slowly, unable to hide a shy smile. "I won't let you down, sir." "I hope not," Henry replied, trying to sound serious, though a small spark of warmth shone in his voice. "I'm not an easy boss." The diner door opened at that moment, and a sturdy man with thick eyebrows and a heavy mustache appeared, carrying a box of produce. It was Art, the local supplier, who entered without ceremony, as was his custom. "Henry," he exclaimed in his rough voice, "I've got your week's vegetables, but I swear this is the last time if you don't pay me something of what you owe." Henry sighed in frustration and walked toward him. "You're not going to leave me alone, are you? If I didn't collect my debts, how do you think I support my family?" Art replied harshly, though his gaze reflected a certain sympathy for Henry. "And who's this?" Art turned his head and fixed his eyes on Jack, who, still nervous, remained standing by the table, clasping his hands behind his back. "A helper," Henry answered quickly. "He's new." Art looked him up and down with that distrustful expression that only men hardened by business knew how to make. Jack's eyes didn't move an inch. "You better hope he's not a problem," Art said in a low voice. "This place has enough trouble already." "He won't be," Henry replied firmly. "And about my debt, I promise I'll pay. Just give me a few more days." Art left the box on the counter with a thud and walked out without saying goodbye, leaving the sound of the door as an echo of his presence. Henry let out a heavy sigh and then looked at Jack. "You see," he said with a bitter smile, "my life isn't so different from yours. We're both just trying to survive." Jack nodded in silence and began to clear the plates from the table. Henry watched him, somewhat surprised by his diligence and the calm with which he accepted his new role. There was a strange nobility in his behavior, a quiet dignity that seemed foreign to his situation. As Jack washed the dishes in the kitchen, Henry sat at the counter and slowly drank his coffee. For the first time in a long time, the diner didn't feel so empty. Maybe it was because someone else was breathing there, moving between the tables and the kitchen, giving the place a sense of life that he himself could no longer provide. "Who the hell are you, Jack?" he murmured to himself, looking toward the kitchen door. Though he wouldn't admit it, a part of him was beginning to feel that something had changed since the young man's arrival. The boy had brought something to the diner, even if he didn't yet know exactly what. The next morning arrived with a soft glow filtering through the diner's windows. The sun's rays illuminated the worn tables and the well-placed silverware, as if the place had awakened to a new life. Henry, sitting in a corner with a cup of coffee, watched Jack attentively as he worked in the kitchen with quick, precise movements. The old clock read 8:30 a.m. when Mrs. Gable pushed open the front door with her grocery bag in hand. The woman, with her grey hair pulled back in a perfect bun, stopped short upon seeing the immaculate dining room and the gentle aroma of coffee and cinnamon that filled the air. "Good heavens, Henry!" she exclaimed in amazement. "What miracle happened here?" Henry smiled slightly, taking a sip of his coffee. "You're not going to believe it, Mrs. Gable." He nodded toward the kitchen. "It's the new helper's work." Mrs. Gable squinted, surprised to see Jack appear with a tray of freshly baked apple turnovers. His presence was unexpected, a young man of humble appearance and a serious gaze, but who moved with the confidence of someone who knew every corner of a professional kitchen. "And who is this?" Mrs. Gable asked suspiciously, placing her bag on a table. "His name is Jack," Henry replied. "He spent the night here because of the rain, and now it seems he has no intention of leaving." Mrs. Gable approached the counter, scrutinizing the young man with a critical eye, like a grandmother sizing up a new family member. Jack, however, seemed unfazed. In a calm but firm voice, he greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am. I made some turnovers. I hope you like them." The woman blinked, surprised, and took a piece of the still warm pastry. She tasted it carefully, letting the flavor fill her palate. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any words. "You made this?" she finally asked, with a mix of admiration and astonishment. Jack nodded, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "It's a simple recipe. I learned it a long time ago." Henry watched the scene from his corner, trying to hide a smile. There was something about Jack's demeanor that disarmed even Mrs. Gable's fiercest criticism. "Well, Henry," the woman said after another bite, "if this boy can cook like this, maybe you still have a chance to save this place." "Save it?" Henry replied ironically, shaking his head. "Not even if the patron saint of cooks himself showed up here, Mrs. Gable. The debts don't just disappear on their own." Jack, who was listening silently from the kitchen, stopped what he was doing and came out into the dining room, his hands still damp. "We can try," he said in a firm voice, surprising them both. "If you let me, I can help you change the menu." Henry looked at him with a frown. "Change the menu? And who do you think you are to tell me how to run my diner?" "I don't mean to offend, Mr. Henry," Jack replied calmly, "but this place needs something new, a dish that makes people want to come back, something that reminds them what it means to eat with heart." "Eat with heart," Henry scoffed, though his eyes betrayed a spark of curiosity. Mrs. Gable, who had remained silent, looked at him sternly. "Listen to him, Henry. What more can you lose? You're already at the bottom. Maybe this boy is right." The room fell silent for a few moments. Henry looked at Jack attentively, as if trying to read in his eyes what he wasn't saying out loud. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "All right," he said, giving in. "But don't expect this to be easy. We need customers, and I don't have money to waste on experiments. If you're going to try something, it has to be with what we already have here." Jack nodded gratefully and returned to the kitchen with renewed energy. Henry followed him with his gaze, still skeptical, but with a small spark of hope. Mid-morning, the sound of the door announced the arrival of a customer. It was Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who used to stop by occasionally for coffee and to read his newspaper. Henry greeted him with a forced smile and prepared to serve his usual order. "We have fresh apple turnovers today," he said, as if tossing a coin into the air. "Turnovers?" Mr. Henderson repeated with interest. "All right, bring me one." Henry, with some nervousness, brought the plate to the table. Mr. Henderson took a bite and fell silent for a long moment. Finally, he looked up with a smile Henry hadn't seen on him in years. "Who made this?" he asked with curiosity. "It's the best turnover I've had in a long time." "A new helper," Henry replied with a mix of pride and surprise. "His name is Jack." "Well, give him my compliments," Mr. Henderson said, returning to his newspaper. "I'm going to bring some friends one of these days. They need to try this." Henry returned to the counter without saying a word, but inside, he felt something beginning to change. For the first time in years, someone promised to return to the diner. He looked toward the kitchen, where Jack worked tirelessly, and couldn't help but think that maybe Mrs. Gable was right. Perhaps that boy had brought with him not just a new recipe, but an unexpected opportunity to start over. "Let's see if you can really save this place, Jack," Henry murmured with a spark of determination in his eyes that he hadn't felt in a long time. The sun had barely risen when Henry went down to the diner, finding Jack already awake and moving in the kitchen as if he'd been working there for years. It was strange how this young man, who had appeared just 2 nights before, seemed to understand the rhythm of the place better than he did. "What time did you wake up?" Henry asked, leaning on the doorframe. "A while ago," Jack replied without turning around, focused on finely chopping some vegetables. "I wanted to get a head start." The aroma coming from the pans was comforting. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to enjoy the smell of sizzling garlic and caramelized onions. It was a scent that reminded him of the time when his father filled that same kitchen with laughter and bustle, when the diner's tables were never empty. "What are you making?" Henry asked, walking into the kitchen. "Tomato bisque," Jack answered calmly. "It's a simple recipe, but if it's done right, people always come back for more." Henry crossed his arms and watched him work with a mix of skepticism and admiration. It wasn't just the boy's talent that surprised him, but the way he seemed to give purpose to every movement, as if that boiling pot was the only thing that mattered in the world. "We'll see if you're right," he muttered, turning to check the old notebook where he jotted down the few daily sales. The hours passed slowly, and although Henry didn't have much hope that anyone would show up, Jack remained focused on his tasks. Around noon, the door creaked open, and Chloe, a young woman of about 22 with her hair in a messy ponytail, walked in. She was a culinary student and sometimes came by for a quick bite while studying. "What's on the menu today, Mr. Henry?" she asked with a cheerful voice. Henry, still surprised by the visit, could barely stammer. "Tomato bisque," he finally replied, pointing toward the kitchen. "The new helper made it." Chloe raised an eyebrow with curiosity and settled into one of the booths. Henry watched her as he served the dish, making sure the presentation was perfect. The steaming soup, the crispy grilled cheese croutons, and a touch of cream and fresh cheese on top. Though he wouldn't admit it, he felt a slight pride as he placed the plate in front of her. "Tomato bisque," Chloe repeated, cautiously picking up her spoon. "Let's see." Henry watched nervously as she tasted the first spoonful. It seemed like an eternity until Chloe looked up, her eyes lit up with surprise. "This is amazing," she exclaimed, smiling. "Who made this?" "Jack, the new helper," Henry replied, looking toward the kitchen. At that moment, Jack came out with a cloth over his shoulder and his hands still damp. "Good morning," he said shyly, avoiding direct eye contact. "Are you the one who cooked this?" Chloe asked, pointing to the plate. "It's delicious. I'm studying at the Culinary Institute, and I can tell you, not just anyone can make this." Jack smiled slightly, tilting his head in thanks. Henry, for his part, watched the scene attentively. It had been years since anyone said something good about the food at his diner. "If this keeps up, I'm going to start coming more often," Chloe said. "It's just what I needed." "Tell your friends," Henry replied, his tone more cheerful than he intended. The young woman left shortly after, leaving a good tip on the table. Henry, still surprised, watched her leave and then turned to Jack. "Not bad, kid," he said, as if it were a major compliment. "But don't get too excited. We need more than one student to save this place." Jack nodded without a word and returned to the kitchen. But in the following days, something began to change. The tomato bisque became a popular dish among the few regular customers who still came, and slowly, new faces began to appear. Henry couldn't help but feel a spark of hope growing inside him, though he did his best not to show it. However, not all was good news. Art, the supplier, reappeared one day afternoon. He entered with a frown and his usual tone firm, but not entirely cruel. "Henry, my friend," he said, resting his hands on the counter. "I'm glad to see you're getting some business, but we need to talk about your debt. I can't wait much longer." Henry pressed his lips together, feeling the weight of reality crushing him again. "Give me a little more time, Art. I promise I'll pay every last cent." Art glanced toward the kitchen, where Jack was working tirelessly. "And you're sure you can trust that kid?" he asked suspiciously. "More than I've trusted other people in my life," Henry replied without hesitation. Art didn't insist further, but he made it clear that time was running out. When he left, Henry felt a mix of frustration and anguish. All of Jack's effort would mean nothing if the diner closed. That night, after closing, Henry sat across from Jack, who was drinking some water. "I want to propose something to you," Henry said seriously. "Stay and help me turn this place around. I can't pay you, but you'll have a roof over your head and food. What happens after that, we'll see." Jack looked at him, surprised by the offer. For a moment, silence filled the space between them. "Why are you helping me?" he finally asked. Henry thought for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes, when you hit rock bottom, the only thing left is to trust someone else." Jack smiled shyly and nodded. "Okay, Mr. Henry, I'll stay." Henry felt a small weight lift from his chest. Maybe there was still time to save the diner. Maybe this was his second chance. The morning dawned with a clear sky, as if the storm from the previous days had decided to leave along with the week's troubles. Henry went down to the diner and, for the first time in years, was met with something that sparked a bit of pride. The place had life. Jack was already in the kitchen, whisking something with energy and precision. The smell of freshly baked pastries and warm spices filled the entire space. "Do you ever sleep?" Henry joked as he poured himself a cup of coffee. Jack barely smiled, not stopping his movements. "Only when necessary." That answer only fueled Henry's curiosity. There was something about the young man, an air of professionalism, but also a constant sadness reflected in his eyes whenever silence fell between them. What story was he hiding? At 11 in the morning, the first customer of the day arrived. It was Mr. Henderson, who had already become a regular since trying the tomato bisque. This time, however, he didn't come alone. He was accompanied by two other men his age, dressed in worn suits and well-placed hats. "Henry," Mr. Henderson greeted in a cheerful voice, "I brought a couple of friends. I've been telling them wonderful things about your soup and the pastries you have here." "Welcome," Henry replied, trying to contain his surprise as Jack prepared the orders with nimble hands. Henry served coffee to the three men. Upon returning with the steaming mugs, he overheard one of the comments that made him clench his teeth. "Who does the cooking?" one of Mr. Henderson's friends asked with a curious tone. "A new kid he has here," Mr. Henderson replied. "A hidden chef, if you ask me." "Chef?" the other man blurted out, letting out an incredulous laugh. "In this place?" Henry gripped the edge of the tray, restraining the urge to respond. He knew well that people spoke of the diner with contempt, as if it were an abandoned ruin. But not this time. Not while Jack was working in the kitchen. "Take a bite, and then we'll talk," Henry replied firmly, leaving the cups on the table. Minutes later, the three men tried the soup and the pastries. Henry watched from a distance as their expressions changed from initial skepticism to a clear expression of surprise and delight. "Mr. Delia." Henderson nodded with a satisfied smile, his recommendation validated. "This kid has talent," one of them finally said. "It's been a while since I've eaten something like this." When they finished eating and paid, they even left a small tip, something that hadn't happened in a long time. Henry looked at the coins on the table and let out a sigh of relief. "We did it," he said, almost to himself, as he returned to the kitchen. "Jack, it seems we're building a clientele again." The young man smiled but said nothing. He continued to clean his knife with a careful gesture, as if that victory didn't quite belong to him. Henry watched him attentively, feeling that the time had come to talk. "Jack, listen to me," he said in a calm tone. "What did you do before you came here? Because you don't cook like someone who just learned. This is talent." Jack paused for an instant, his eyes fixed on the sink where the water was still running. For a moment, Henry thought the young man wouldn't answer, but finally, Jack sighed and murmured, "I was a chef." Henry blinked, surprised, and sat in one of the chairs by the counter. "A chef? Where?" "I worked in several restaurants," Jack replied without looking at him. "Big kitchens with lots of people. I was a sous chef in one of the most renowned places in the city." Henry couldn't believe what he was hearing. How was it possible that someone like that ended up on the street? "And what happened?" he asked gently. Jack pressed his lips together and fell silent for a long time. The tension in his shoulders became evident, as if that simple question had brought back an unbearable weight. "I lost everything that mattered," he finally replied, his voice barely audible. "My family. An accident. After that I couldn't go on. I left everything. Nothing mattered to me anymore." The confession hung in the air like a heavy blow. Henry felt his heart ache in his chest. For a moment he didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry, kid," he murmured with a sincerity that came from his soul. "No one should have to carry something like that." "It doesn't matter anymore," Jack replied, with an attempt at a smile. "You can't change the past." Henry looked at him with a mix of compassion and admiration. This young man had been through hell, and yet there he was, standing, cooking with a dedication that few men could match. "Look, Jack," Henry finally said, "we're not rich here, but as long as this place is standing, you'll have a roof over your head, food, and a purpose. Sometimes we don't need to start from scratch, but to start over from where we are." Jack looked up, surprised by those words. For an instant, Henry could see something different in his eyes, a spark of hope, faint but real. "Thank you, Mr. Henry," Jack replied, this time with more warmth in his voice. "I won't let you down." "I know," Henry replied, getting up. "Now come on, we have customers to feed." As Jack returned to his tasks, Henry stood in the kitchen doorway watching him. He had learned a lot in his life, but that morning he understood something new. Second chances aren't found, they're built. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sound of cutlery clashing on the tables. Although the diner wasn't full that day, the tables weren't empty, and for Henry, that was reason enough to smile from time to time. Jack, focused as always, worked behind the counter, adjusting details and monitoring every plate that left the kitchen, a perfect, almost obsessive but impeccable order. Henry was surprised. The young man not only cooked like a professional chef, but also had a clear idea of how to make each dish a small work of art, even with the simplest and most modest ingredients. However, that calm barely lasted until mid-afternoon, when Art showed up again at the diner. "Henry," Art said in a firm voice, resting his large hands on the counter, "I need to talk to you." Henry, who was drying a glass behind the counter, put down the cloth with a deep sigh. "Here we go again, Art. I already told you I'm working on it. You've been telling me the same thing for months." Art replied harshly, "I can't give you any more time. If you don't pay at least part of the debt this week, you'll have to close." The echo of those words seemed to resonate throughout the diner. Jack, listening from the kitchen, pressed his lips together with concern. Mrs. Gable, who at that moment was cleaning one of the tables, looked at Henry with sadness, as if she herself felt the weight of the news. "Art, please," Henry said in a lower, almost pleading tone. "Things are starting to get better. Give me a few more days. The place is starting to have life again." Art shook his head, firm in his position. "I'm sorry, Henry. I like you, but this isn't personal. It's business. I'll be back on Friday. If there's no money, you'll have to hand over the diner." Without another word, Art left the place, the squeak of the door echoing his departure. The silence that followed was oppressive. Henry remained standing behind the counter, his eyes fixed on the cash register, as if hoping the money he so desperately needed would magically appear. Jack came out of the kitchen and looked at him seriously. "Is it true what he said?" he asked in a soft voice. "Could you lose the diner?" "Yes," Henry replied without looking up. "It's always been at risk, but now it's worse." "And what are you going to do?" Henry sighed and looked up at Jack. "I don't know, kid. Hopefully more customers will come tomorrow and we can scrape something together. But praying to the saints isn't enough." Jack stood thoughtfully for a moment, frowning as if evaluating all the possibilities. Then, with unexpected firmness, he said, "Let's have a special night." "A special night?" "A different menu," Jack explained. "I can create a tasting menu, something to attract people, an event where we can show what this place can offer." Henry looked at him incredulously, almost mockingly. "A special night? Jack, we're not in one of those fancy restaurants where you used to work. Old customers come here for a cup of coffee and not much else." "It doesn't matter," Jack replied firmly. "If we prepare something truly special, people will come. All we need is for them to talk about us, for the word to spread." Henry hesitated. The idea sounded crazy, but what other option did he have? If he didn't do something soon, Art would close the diner, and all the effort of the past few weeks would be for nothing. "All right," he finally said, running a hand through his graying hair. "But if this goes wrong, I swear." "It's going to go well," Jack replied with confidence, interrupting him. That night, as the diner closed, Jack spent hours in the kitchen, experimenting with the few ingredients they had. Henry, from his small corner, watched with a mix of admiration and worry. The young man worked with a passion he hadn't seen in anyone for years, as if this special night was also his last chance. Mrs. Gable stayed late, watching from the corner of her eye from the dining room as she mopped the floors. When she passed by Henry, she murmured in a low voice, "That boy is not like the others, Henry. He has something special." Henry nodded in silence, without responding. For the first time in a long time, he felt something more than despair. He felt a glimmer of hope. The next day, Chloe, the young culinary student, arrived early. Henry, surprised, watched her enter with a smile. "What are you doing here so early?" he asked. "Jack asked for my help," she replied, leaving her backpack on a chair. "He wants me to help spread the word about tonight's event. I have friends who can come, even some professors." Henry didn't know what to say. All of this seemed like an impossible dream, but now he felt that the small team that had formed was beginning to move like a well-oiled machine. "Jack, you better hope this works," he murmured, looking toward the kitchen. When the clock struck 7 p.m., the first lights came on in the diner. Henry felt his nerves tingle. The room was clean, the tables decorated with small tablecloths and candles that Jack and Mrs. Gable had improvised. At 8:30 p.m., the first customers arrived. Henry greeted them with a forced smile, while Jack and Chloe worked in the kitchen. Time moved slowly, like a countdown. For a moment it seemed the night would be a failure, but when the first dish came out of the kitchen, something changed. The customers' eyes lit up as they tasted Jack's preparations. A whisper of surprise and satisfaction began to ripple through the tables. By 10 p.m., the diner was fuller than it had been in years. The noise of conversations and laughter replaced the silence that had tormented him for so long. Henry, standing behind the counter, could hardly believe what he was seeing. "We did it," he murmured to himself with a smile he didn't remember how to feel. In the kitchen, Jack worked without rest, but with a sparkle in his eyes that Henry had never seen before. That night wasn't just an event, it was the first test passed, the first of many. Dawn surprised Henry in a chair at the diner, his arms crossed over his chest and a sleepy smile on his face. The candles had completely burned down, leaving only traces of wax on the tables. The dining room, for the first time in years, had been full, and the special night that Jack had devised not only attracted customers, but also returned to Henry a spark of hope he thought was extinguished. "Aren't you going to sleep, Mr. Henry?" Jack asked from the kitchen doorway, a cloth over his shoulder. Henry slowly opened his eyes and shook his head, stretching his tired shoulders. "I'll sleep when the problems solve themselves," he responded with a sarcastic tone, though his eyes held an unusual glimmer. "You did it, kid. That dinner was crazy." Jack offered a modest smile, wiping his hands. "It wasn't just me. Chloe helped a lot and you kept everything running. We're a team." Henry frowned, but deep down, He felt something warm in his chest. A team. He hadn't heard that word applied to his life in years. Maybe Jack was right. The door opened at that moment, and Chloe entered, carrying a stack of cookbooks under her arm. Her hair was in a braid, and she had a contagious enthusiasm that Henry found hard to ignore. "Good morning," she exclaimed, leaving the books on a table. "I talked to some of my professors, and they were impressed with what I told them about last night. They said they want to come and try the food." "Professors," Henry repeated, arching an eyebrow. "From the Culinary Institute, yes," Chloe responded with enthusiasm. "Jack is doing incredible things here, and the world needs to see it." Henry let out a dry laugh, though deep down, a bit of pride swelled within him. Culinary professors coming to his diner? He wouldn't have imagined it even in his best days. He turned his gaze to Jack, who avoided eye contact, somewhat uncomfortable with the praise. "Don't exaggerate, Chloe," Jack murmured, returning to the kitchen. "I'm just doing what I can." "What you can do is much more than you think," Chloe responded firmly, following him. Henry watched the scene with interest. The young woman admired him, that was clear, but there was something more, a spark of recognition, as if she saw something in him that Jack himself was trying to hide. That day passed calmly, but something had changed. The tables didn't fill up like the night before, but there was a steady flow. New customers appeared, asking about the new special recipe, and Henry, though still skeptical, began to see a pattern. Jack was right. The diner needed something new, something that would make people talk about it. As evening fell, Henry found Jack in the kitchen, cleaning with the same obsessive care as always. "Hey, kid," Henry said, leaning on the doorframe. "I want to propose something to you." Jack looked at him with curiosity, without stopping his hands. "I want us to work together," Henry said in a serious voice. "This place needs to be reborn, and I think we can do it. But we need a plan. You have the ideas and the hands to do it, but I need you to trust me too." Jack frowned, as if those words took him by surprise. "Why do you trust me?" he asked with sincerity. "Because I have nothing left to lose," Henry responded, shrugging. "And to be honest, what you did last night reminded me of something I had forgotten. People can change. Places can too." Jack remained silent for a moment, thoughtful. Finally he nodded. "All right, Mr. Henry, we'll work together. But I want you to promise me something. Don't give up." Henry let out a laugh, surprising the young man. "Kid, I've spent so many years giving up that I don't even remember how to fight. Maybe you're teaching me." Jack offered a small smile and returned to his work. Chloe, who had been listening from the entrance, couldn't help but intervene. "If you're going to renovate the diner, count me in," she said, crossing her arms. "I need to learn from someone like Jack." "Learn from me?" Jack asked, surprised. "Of course," she replied firmly. "I've never seen someone cook with so much passion. You don't just make food, you tell stories with every dish." Henry watched the conversation and felt the accumulated fatigue of years begin to dissipate. Perhaps there was still a way to save his father's legacy. With Jack and Chloe by his side, for the first time in a long time, the idea of a future seemed less distant. As night fell, while they were turning off the diner's lights, Henry looked at the empty place. But this time, he didn't see it as a tomb of broken dreams, but as a space full of possibilities. Jack and Chloe said goodbye, leaving Henry alone for a moment before he went up to his small apartment. Henry stood at the kitchen door and murmured, almost to himself, "Maybe, old man, we can still do it." He looked up at the ceiling, where he imagined his father, Emilio, watching him from some corner of the universe, and for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't completely alone. It was a serene afternoon as Henry, Jack, and Chloe worked with a meticulous rhythm. The clientele was slowly starting to grow, and the sound of cutlery against plates and the soft laughter of diners filled the air. It wasn't an overwhelming bustle, but for Henry, these small details were signs of life. Every customer who came in and out left a pinch of hope in his heart. Jack, for his part, continued to work in silence, with an almost obsessive dedication. The kitchen, which was once a dull and worn-out place, now vibrated with activity. The heat of the oven, the aroma of spices, and the steam from the pots gave it an air of rebirth. Henry watched everything from the counter, his face marked by fatigue, but with something different, a flame that hadn't shone in his eyes for years. The door opened suddenly, making the bell that hung above it ring. Henry looked up with curiosity and felt the air around him thicken. A tall man with an arrogant demeanor and perfectly coiffed grey hair entered with firm steps. He was wearing an elegant dark coat, and his cold gaze explored every corner of the diner until it settled on the counter. "Good afternoon," the man said in a deep but polite voice. "I was told this place has an interesting menu lately." Henry studied him carefully. There was something about that man that made him uncomfortable, a dominant and calculating presence that didn't fit the humble atmosphere of the diner. "Welcome," Henry replied with forced politeness. "Please, sit wherever you like." The man smiled sideways and chose a table near the window. Chloe, who had just come out of the kitchen with a tray in her hands, glanced at him and noticed the tension in Henry's expression. "Is everything okay?" she whispered. "I don't know," Henry murmured with a frown. "I don't like the look of that guy." In the kitchen, Jack was working, unaware of who had entered. But when Chloe approached to pick up a plate and casually murmured, "There's a weird customer out there. Looks like someone important," Jack jerked his head up, his face paling slightly. "Important?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," Chloe replied. "An older man, elegant. Doesn't look like he's from the neighborhood." Jack dropped the knife he was holding, making a sharp noise against the cutting board. Chloe looked at him, surprised. "Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. "What does he look like?" Jack murmured with difficulty. "Tall, grey hair, dark coat," Chloe replied slowly. Jack took a deep breath and leaned against the kitchen wall, as if the world around him were crumbling. He knew perfectly well who it was. "Do you know him?" Chloe insisted, her eyes wide. "It's Julian Croft," Jack finally replied in a thread of a voice. Chloe put her hand to her mouth. She had heard that name before. Julian Croft was a renowned chef, owner of some of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. He was a legend in the culinary world, but also known for his implacable and ruthless character. Meanwhile, in the dining room, Henry was serving coffee to the newcomer. "Are you from around here?" Henry asked, trying to make conversation. "Let's just say I like to get to know new places and old acquaintances," Julian replied with a frosty smile. At that moment, Jack appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was tense, but his steps were firm. Henry looked at him, surprised. "What are you doing out here?" Henry murmured. "Stay in the kitchen, I'll handle this." "No," Jack interrupted, breathing deeply. "It's time to face this." The room fell silent as Jack stopped in front of Julian. For a moment, the chef slowly raised his gaze and smiled ironically. "Well, well," he said with a sneer. "Jack Miller, the prodigy who vanished. I never imagined I'd find you in a place like this." Henry and Chloe watched the scene, unable to intervene. The tension was palpable. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked in a tense voice, not returning the smile. "The same as everyone else," Julian replied, leaning back slightly. "To eat. But to be honest, I came to see with my own eyes what became of you. I heard rumors about a talented young chef in this neighborhood and wondered if it might be you, ruined, as I expected." Jack clenched his fists, restraining his anger. Julian's words were like knives stabbing at his pride. "I didn't come here to listen to you, Julian," Jack replied coldly. "If you want to eat, eat. If not, get out." Julian let out a low, sarcastic laugh. "Still the same impulsive kid. I thought after what happened, you would have learned your place, but I see you haven't." That last phrase made Jack take a step forward, but Henry stopped him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "That's enough," Henry said firmly, looking at Julian with a hard stare. "We're not here to argue or waste time with provocations. If you want to eat, go ahead. If not, there are plenty of doors you can leave through." Julian looked at Henry with disdain but finally stood up, grabbing his coat. "I wouldn't expect less from a place like this," he said with a cruel smile. "Sooner or later, Jack, the world always remembers who is truly strong and who is not." Without another word, he left the diner, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Henry let out a sigh and looked at Jack, who was still trembling slightly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Who was that man, Jack?" Henry asked gently. "My mentor," Jack replied with difficulty. "And my greatest failure." Chloe watched him sadly, not knowing what to say. Henry, for his part, understood that Jack carried a much heavier burden than he had imagined. "Listen, kid. Henry said, breaking the silence. "It doesn't matter who that guy was or what he thinks. This place needs you, and you're doing things he will never understand." Jack looked at him with glassy eyes but nodded slowly. "Thanks, Mr. Henry," he murmured. As night fell on the diner, Henry looked through the window with a clear idea in his mind. That man, Julian Croft, would not humiliate Jack again, not while he was there to defend him. The next morning brought a heavy air to the diner. Although the sun was shining brightly, the encounter with Julian Croft the night before seemed to have cast a dark shadow over Jack. Henry noticed it in the way the young man worked. His movements were still precise, but the passion that had filled the kitchen since his arrival was missing. Chloe saw it too, and from time to time tried to lift his spirits with a joke or a comment, but Jack barely responded. Mrs. Gable, ever observant, murmured in a low voice as she cleaned a table near the counter, "That boy has something stuck in his soul, Henry. You can see it on his face." "I know," Henry replied, sighing deeply. "But how do I help him if he won't tell me everything?" Jack didn't mention a single word more about Julian, but his lost gaze betrayed him. For the first time, he seemed like a man on the verge of giving up. That morning, Art appeared with his usual expression, serious, but with that friendly air that kept him halfway between a friend and a relentless collector. He pushed the door open forcefully and left a piece of paper on the counter. "Henry, I can't wait any longer," he said in a grave tone. "I heard the rumors about last night's success, but success doesn't pay the bills. Here's the final warning. If you don't cover at least a portion by Friday, the matter will go to the lawyers." Henry took the paper and looked at it with tired eyes. It was a formal notice threatening to foreclose on the diner. Art wasn't joking. Time was running out. "Art, give me time," Henry tried to say in a faint voice. "Time is no longer a luxury you can afford, my friend," Art replied, though there was some compassion in his voice. "If you keep going like this, you won't get out of it. Think about it. Sell the diner before you lose it all." That last phrase hit Henry like a punch. Sell the diner? The only inheritance his father had left him. Was that the way out, to give up the last thing he had of his family in exchange for peace? "I won't do it," he responded firmly, though doubt still gnawed at him. Art sighed, picking up his notebook. "I warned you. I'll be back on Friday to collect." When Art left, Henry slumped into a chair behind the counter, the paper still trembling in his hands. The kitchen door opened slowly, and Jack appeared with a worried expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, putting his cloth aside. "Nothing you don't already know," Henry replied bitterly. "Art wants to take the diner if I don't pay part of the debt by Friday." The silence that followed was dense. Jack looked at the floor, clenching his fists, and finally spoke. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can attract more people. Last night was a success. If we keep working, we can make it." "You really think we can raise that much money in such a short time?" Henry responded with a broken voice, looking at the young man. "Sometimes hard work isn't enough, Jack." Jack remained silent. The frustration was evident on his face, but he wasn't ready to give up. Chloe, who had been listening from the doorway, approached with determination. "What if we do something big?" she proposed. "A theme night, like a festival. Let's invite more people, offer a special menu with new dishes. I can help spread the word, and I'm sure Jack can create something incredible." Henry shook his head skeptically. "A festival? We don't have money for that, Chloe." "We don't need much," she replied with energy. "We just need ideas, and you said it yourself. We're hitting rock bottom. There's nothing more to lose." Jack looked up at Chloe's words. His eyes, though tired, reflected something else, a flash of fight that had been absent since the night before. "Henry, let us try," Jack said firmly. "If we fail, at least we'll have gone down fighting." Henry looked at them both, first at Chloe and then at Jack. They were young, full of energy and hope, two things he had lost years ago. For a moment, he felt the weight of his responsibility, but then something inside him seemed to ignite. "All right," he finally responded in a hoarse voice. "Let's do it. But this will be our last bet." Jack nodded and immediately turned toward the kitchen, as if that decision had brought him back to life. Chloe pulled out her phone and began sending frantic messages to her friends and contacts. "I'll take care of bringing people," she said confidently. "Leave everything else in Jack's hands." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Jack spent the entire day in the kitchen, testing recipes, adjusting flavors, and creating something new and special. Chloe didn't stop calling acquaintances, sending invitations, and even designing small flyers to post around the neighborhood. Henry, meanwhile, dedicated himself to cleaning the diner as if he were about to receive the highest royalty. Every corner shone, every table was carefully prepared. The nervousness grew, but so did a strange sense of hope. As night fell, the diner was ready. Jack came out of the kitchen with a tray in his hand, placed a decorated plate on the counter, and looked at it with pride. "This will be our star dish," he said firmly. "A mix of what I was and what I am now." Henry looked at him and nodded, moved. "All right, kid, we're giving it our all tonight." As the first streetlights began to dim, the diner door opened. The first customers entered, and with them, an air of possibility filled the place. Henry took a deep breath. It was time to face their destiny. The night had arrived, and the diner was lit in a special, almost magical way. Small candles flickered on the tables, and the aroma of warm spices and freshly baked bread filled the air. Jack had worked all day preparing every detail of the special menu, while Chloe rushed back and forth, organizing the tables and adjusting the small improvised decorations. Henry, with a cloth over his shoulder, was checking the final details behind the counter. "Ready, kid?" Henry asked, leaning into the kitchen. Jack, with his clean apron and sweat beading on his forehead, nodded with a sparkle in his eyes that Henry hadn't seen since he arrived. "Ready," he replied firmly. "No matter what happens, we're going to give it our best." Henry watched him for a moment, recognizing in him an unshakable determination, something he himself had forgotten over the years. Somehow that young man had brought something to the diner that neither debts nor time could erase: hope. The first hour was slow. The tables were just beginning to fill, and silence still hung heavy in the air. Henry nervously watched the clock, while Jack worked in the kitchen, controlling his emotions with a forced calm. Chloe, however, didn't lose her energy. She moved from one side to the other with enthusiasm, welcoming each customer with a warm smile and offering detailed explanations of the night's special menu. "Looks like more are coming," Chloe murmured, peeking through the door. "There's my culinary professor." Henry turned his head just as an older, elegant but approachable man entered with a small group. Chloe greeted them joyfully and led them to a central table, leaving an animated murmur in the air that soon began to spread to the other diners. "This is starting to work," Henry said, trying to hide the relief in his voice. Suddenly the door opened again, and Mr. Henderson entered, accompanied by 3 other friends. The old man, who was already a regular customer since trying the tomato bisque, raised his hand in greeting. "We came for the special menu, Henry. I hope it's as good as they say." "We won't disappoint you," Henry replied, feeling his heart beat faster. As the tables filled up, the noise of conversations and laughter began to transform the diner. The place that for years had been a shadow of its former self seemed to come alive. Henry walked between the tables, serving dishes carefully and listening with excitement to the murmurs of admiration from the customers. "This is delicious," commented one of Chloe's professors, savoring an appetizer. "Who's in the kitchen?" "A very talented young man," Chloe replied with pride. "Jack Miller." The professor raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Miller? The same Jack Miller who worked with Julian Croft?" Chloe swallowed and nodded slowly. The man smiled as if he had just discovered something significant. "That kid has golden hands," he murmured, returning to his plate. Henry overheard the conversation from the counter and felt a mix of pride and worry stir inside him. The name Julian Croft still followed Jack like a shadow, but what mattered was what he was achieving at that moment, with his own hands and on his own path. Midway through the night, Henry entered the kitchen to get another order and found Jack moving among the pots and pans with surgical precision. It was as if the young man was made for this place. However, there was something else in his expression, a different calm, a confidence that was just beginning to blossom. "Kid," Henry said, leaning on the door, "you're doing it." Jack looked up, surprised, and smiled slightly. "Thanks, Mr. Henry," he replied in a soft voice. "But we're not done yet." "It doesn't matter," Henry said with a sincere smile. "Whatever happens, this is already a victory." When Henry left the kitchen, he felt the weight of his doubts begin to dissipate from his shoulders. The diner was full, people were smiling, and Jack was shining. Maybe they hadn't won the war against the debts yet, but that night was proof of what they could achieve together. In one of the corners, Mrs. Gable watched everything with a nostalgic smile. She approached Henry as he served another order. "You see, Henry," she said in a soft voice, "I told you from the beginning. This boy came to change everything." Henry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Yes, Mrs. Gable, I think you were right." The night continued well into the early hours. In the end, when the last customer left and the door was closed, the diner fell silent again. But it was a different silence, one filled with satisfaction. Henry slumped into a chair and looked at Jack, who was cleaning the kitchen with a serene expression. "We did well today, Jack," Henry said with a tone of pride he couldn't hide. "I'm sure Emilio would be happy." Jack looked up and smiled shyly. "Thanks for trusting me, Mr. Henry." Henry shook his head and replied in a firm voice, "Thank you, kid, for reminding me that this place still has a soul." That night, as Henry turned off the diner's lights, he stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the room now full of promises. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the future. The night of the event had been a resounding success, but the following morning brought a restless calm. The diner was clean, quiet, and bathed in the pale light of dawn. Henry, tired but satisfied, came down the stairs from his small apartment, hoping to find Jack in the kitchen as usual. "Jack?" he called, peeking through the ajar door. There was no answer. The kitchen was empty. The stove's flame was out, and on the countertop there were still traces of flour and eggshells from the night before. Everything was in order, but Jack was gone. Henry frowned, feeling a small knot form in his chest. "He must have gone for a walk," he murmured, trying to convince himself. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the counter, drumming his fingers on the worn wooden surface. An hour passed, then two, and Jack still hadn't appeared. The door finally opened, but it wasn't Jack who entered. It was Chloe, with her backpack and a smile that faded when she noticed Henry's worried expression. "What happened?" she asked, leaving her things on a table. "I don't know where Jack is," Henry replied in a grave tone. "He hasn't been here since last night." "Maybe he went to rest. He worked like crazy all day," Chloe tried to say, though her voice also reflected concern. "He's not one to just disappear like that," Henry replied, standing up. "Something's not right." Mrs. Gable, who arrived shortly after, overheard the conversation while hanging her bag on a hook behind the counter. Her expression hardened. "That boy carries something heavy, Henry," she said, crossing her arms. "Maybe that visit from Julian stirred up more than we thought." The mention of Julian Croft made Henry press his lips together in frustration. That shadow from the past seemed to have loomed over Jack again, taking him to a place none of them could reach. "I'm going to look for him," Henry said decisively, grabbing his jacket. "I'm going too," Chloe hurried to say. "Maybe he went somewhere he feels safe." "Chloe, no," Henry replied. "This isn't a neighborhood for you to be wandering around looking for a missing young man. Stay here in case he comes back." "But I want to help," she insisted, her eyes wide. "Jack wouldn't leave me alone if I were in his place." Henry looked at her for a moment and finally nodded. "All right, come with me. Mrs. Gable, stay at the diner. If he comes back, let us know immediately." Mrs. Gable nodded firmly and watched them leave, her brow furrowed and her hands clasped. Anxiety was beginning to settle in for all of them. Henry and Chloe walked the neighborhood streets, asking in shops and among neighbors if anyone had seen Jack. No one knew anything. The hours passed slowly, and each negative response felt like a blow to the stomach. "Do you think something bad happened to him?" Chloe asked with a trembling voice. "I don't know," Henry replied, clenching his teeth, "but I won't stop looking until I find him." They finally reached a small park where homeless people often gathered. The place was full of men and women wrapped in tattered blankets, sitting on benches or under trees. The smell of dampness and despair was palpable. Henry and Chloe began asking some of them, describing Jack in detail. Finally, a man with a white beard and tired eyes nodded. "Yeah, I saw him," the man said. "He came last night and stayed under the awning of that store, didn't talk to anyone." "Thanks," Henry replied urgently. They crossed the park quickly until they reached the indicated awning. There, among old cardboard boxes and plastic bags, was Jack, sitting with his head resting on his knees. He was wearing his worn-out jacket, and his posture was that of a defeated man. "Jack!" Chloe exclaimed, running toward him. The young man slowly lifted his head, and when he saw Henry and Chloe in front of him, his expression shifted from bewilderment to guilt. His eyes were red, and his face was pale and exhausted. "What are you doing here?" he murmured. "Looking for you, kid," Henry replied harshly, though his voice trembled with relief. "What the hell are you doing out here, sprawled on the ground?" "You shouldn't have come," Jack replied, looking away. "I don't deserve to be looked for." Chloe knelt in front of him, gently taking one of his hands. "Why would you say that, Jack? We've been looking for you all day. You worried us." Jack closed his eyes and clenched his fists, holding back tears. The shadow of Julian had caught up with him, reminding him of everything he had lost. "I don't want to drag you down with me," he said in a broken voice. "Everything I touch gets ruined. I lost my family, I lost my career, and if I stay here, you're going to lose everything too." Henry knelt beside him and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Look at me, Jack," he said in a serious voice. "We've all lost something in life, but that doesn't mean we can't start over. You think this diner hasn't been on the brink of collapse every day. You think I haven't wanted to give up 1,000 times. But you came, and you gave me something I had lost years ago. Hope." Jack slowly looked up, tears rolling down his face. Chloe squeezed his hand tighter. "You're not alone, Jack," she said. "Not this time." For a long moment, silence enveloped them, broken only by the distant sound of the wind in the trees. Finally, Jack nodded weakly and let them help him to his feet. Henry looked at him with pride and relief. "Come on, kid," he said gently. "We have a kitchen waiting for you." Jack managed a small smile, just a hint of what it used to be, but enough for Henry to know that all was not lost. The walk back to the diner was quiet but not uncomfortable. Henry walked with firm steps beside Jack, while Chloe moved a few feet ahead, as if the cold afternoon wind were pushing her forward. Jack kept his gaze low, but a slight relief could be seen in his expression, as if the weight he carried on his shoulders had begun to lessen. When they reached the diner, the door was ajar. Mrs. Gable, who was waiting nervously inside, let out a sigh of relief when she saw them enter. "Thank God," she exclaimed, approaching quickly. "Jack, where were you? You had us worried sick, son." Jack, embarrassed, looked down and murmured, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Gable. I didn't mean to worry you." She shook her head, moved, and took his face in both her hands. "You're young, but you're not alone, you hear me? Families don't always come from blood. Sometimes they come from where you least expect," she said sweetly. "And here, we are family." Jack nodded shyly, trying to hold back his tears. Chloe watched him from a distance and smiled slightly. That small moment, that simple declaration, was all he needed to hear. Henry, who was watching the scene from the kitchen doorway, finally broke the silence. "Jack, come here a moment," he said in a firm but not harsh tone. Jack obeyed and followed him to the counter. Henry sat on one of the high stools, his brow furrowed and his arms crossed. "I want you to listen to me carefully, kid," Henry began, looking at him seriously. "What happened last night with that Julian Croft? I don't care who he was in your life or what he told you. The only thing that matters here is what you do now. Understand? That man does not define who you are." Jack swallowed and nodded, but his gaze still reflected doubt. "Sometimes I feel like I can't escape him," he confessed in a low voice. "Julian taught me everything he knew, but when I failed, he let me sink. He told me I didn't have what it takes to be a chef, and after everything that happened with my family, I think maybe he was right." "Lies," Henry grumbled, gently tapping the counter with his fist. "You know what I think of people like Julian? They're cowards. They're afraid of people with talent because they know they can be surpassed. And that's you, Jack. Someone with talent and heart, something he'll never have." The young man looked at him with surprise. Those words hit him harder than any of Julian's criticisms. Henry was not a man of empty compliments, and seeing him speak with such conviction made him feel worthy again. "You believe in me?" Jack asked, almost in a whisper. "Of course I do," Henry replied without hesitation. "You think I brought you back just to wash pots? No, kid. I need you here, with your head held high and your hands working magic in that kitchen. Last night was just a test, and you passed it with flying colors." Jack pressed his lips together and finally nodded. For the first time in a long time, he felt that someone saw in him something more than a failure. "Thank you, Mr. Henry. he said in a trembling voice. "I promise I won't let you down." "It's not about not letting me down," Henry replied with a slight smile. "It's about not letting yourself down." At that moment, Chloe burst into the conversation, her face lit up with an idea. "I know what we have to do," she exclaimed. "Let's organize another special night, but this time, bigger. Let's invite everyone's, customers, neighbors, even local journalists. You, Jack, will do what you do best and show everyone who you really are." "Journalists?" Henry asked, surprised. "Where are you going to get journalists?" "Leave it to me," Chloe replied confidently. "My professor knows people in small media outlets, and I can pull some strings at the university. We just need to give them something worthwhile, and Jack can do that." Jack looked at her, amazed by her enthusiasm. "You think it'll work?" he asked, still doubtful. "Of course it will," Chloe replied firmly. "We just need you to believe it too." Jack took a deep breath and slowly nodded at Henry, who was watching him with disguised pride. "We'll do what needs to be done," Jack said finally. "I'm not giving up." "That's what I wanted to hear," Henry replied, standing up and extending his hand. "Let's do this, kid. Let's show the world who you are." Jack shook his hand firmly, and for the first time in a long time, laughed for real. That night, as the diner slept in silence, Jack stayed alone in the kitchen, experimenting with new recipes. Every cut of the knife, every movement over the skillet, made him feel more alive, more in control of himself. Henry's words echoed in his mind, "Don't let yourself down." As he looked at his hands, stained with flour and oil, he remembered the nights he cooked with his mother and his little sister, laughing together in a kitchen that smelled of home. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but this time, they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of reconciliation. "I'll do it for you," he whispered into the empty air. "I'll do it for me." The light of dawn slowly entered through the diner's windows, bathing the tables in a calm warmth. The silence of the early morning was gradually replaced by the sounds of the waking city, passing cars, street vendors setting up, and the distant murmur of voices and footsteps. In the kitchen, Jack had been working for hours, his firm and steady hands cutting ingredients with almost hypnotic precision. Henry, coming down the stairs, stopped at the kitchen doorway. He watched him in silence for a moment. The young man he had found on that rainy night was no longer the same. He had recovered something he seemed to have lost years ago, his purpose. "Kid, you get up before the sun," Henry commented with a tired but genuine smile. Jack looked up, a speck of flour on his cheek and a calm glint in his eyes. "I prefer to get ahead of the day," he replied. "It makes me feel like I'm in control." Henry nodded and walked to the counter, where he began to prepare his coffee. The strong aroma filled the air, and as he stirred the sugar with his spoon, he gave him a look of approval. "You know what, Jack?" he said in a soft voice. "You are in control, more than you think." Jack smiled sideways and continued with his work. Henry's words weren't just comfort, they were true. In just a few weeks he had transformed the heart of the diner with his talent and dedication. Later, Chloe arrived with her usual enthusiasm, carrying a folder full of notes, flyers, and a phone in her hand. Her energy was contagious, and Henry could no longer imagine the diner without her. "Listen," she exclaimed, leaving her things on a table. "I have good news. I spoke with my professor, and he confirmed that a local food critic is interested in coming to the event. He's one of those who write for blogs and small papers, but his opinion matters a lot." "A food critic?" Henry repeated with a frown. "We're not ready for something like that. What if he doesn't like what we serve?" "That's not going to happen," Chloe replied firmly, looking at Jack, "because Jack knows what he's doing." The young man, listening silently from the kitchen, nodded slowly. Although he felt the pressure, he no longer carried it as a weight. He carried it as a challenge he was ready to face. "What will we prepare?" Chloe asked, approaching. Jack thought for a moment, wiping his hands on a cloth. "I want to prepare something special," he replied. "Something that combines what I learned in my career, but with the traditional flavors that this place represents. A menu that tells our story." Henry looked at him with interest, crossing his arms. "Our story?" "Yes," Jack replied with a sparkle in his eyes. "I want to use your father Emilio's recipes, but give them a unique touch. Respect tradition, but bring it to the present." Henry felt a lump in his throat upon hearing his father's name. Remembering the recipes he had learned as a child, the same ones he had neglected in the difficult years, brought back a mix of nostalgia and pride. "You think you can do it?" Henry asked, trying to hide his emotion. "Yes," Jack replied with conviction. "But I need you to tell me about them, to teach me what your father did." Henry watched him in silence for a moment, feeling something warm grow in his chest. Finally, he nodded. "All right, kid. Tonight I'll teach you my father's recipe, but you better make it the best version this diner has ever seen." "It will be," Jack replied with a slight smile. That night, when the diner closed, Henry and Jack stayed in the kitchen. The heat from the oven and the aroma of spices filled the space, but what stood out was the almost solemn atmosphere. Henry, with an old apron tied around his waist, took out a worn notebook from a drawer. It was Emilio's recipe book, covered in grease stains and yellowed pages. "This," Henry said, placing the notebook on the table, "is what's left of my father's legacy. Every dish he served here, he made with love and patience. He taught me that you don't just cook with your hands, but with your heart." Jack took the notebook carefully, as if holding a precious relic. He opened it slowly, observing the hand-drawn pictures and the clumsy but detailed notes. "Where do we start?" Jack asked. "With my father's signature sauce," Henry replied in a firm voice. "If there was one thing that was always special in this place, it was that sauce. But it requires time, care, and respect." Jack nodded and began to prepare the ingredients under Henry's supervision. Each step was followed with precision. Each mixture was tasted and adjusted with care. For the first time, Henry wasn't just a spectator, he was part of something bigger. The kitchen didn't feel like a place of failure, but like a home where a new story was beginning to be written. As they worked, Henry shared stories of his father, how he had learned to cook from his grandmother, how the diner was the dream he had built brick by brick. "This place wasn't just a business to him," Henry said with a nostalgic voice. "It was his life, his family. He wanted everyone who came in here to feel at home." "That's what we're going to achieve," Jack replied with a determined look. "We're going to make people feel at home again." At dawn, when the sauce was finally ready, Henry and Jack tasted the mixture in silence. The flavor was deep, balanced, and full of memories. Henry closed his eyes and smiled. "You did it, kid," he said in a soft voice. "This tastes like my father." Jack said nothing, but his smile showed pride and relief. He finally felt he had found his place. "Now," Henry said, standing up, "let's show the world what this place can offer." Together they left the kitchen, knowing the path wouldn't be easy, but that the renewal had begun. The sun of the next day shone brightly, as if the city itself were aware of the importance of what was about to happen. The small, humble diner looked different. The windows gleamed, the tables were set with unexpected delicacy, and the aroma of the freshly made signature sauce filled the air with a special warmth. There were no luxuries or ostentatious decorations, but the place radiated a renewed soul. Henry, dressed in his impeccable white shirt and apron tied firmly, was putting the final touches on the dining room. From time to time, he glanced toward the door, anxiously awaiting the arrival of customers. He couldn't afford to fail. Tonight was crucial. The special event had to raise enough to pay Art and avoid the diner's permanent closure. "Everything will be fine, Mr. Henry," Jack said from the kitchen door, with the calm of someone who had accepted the challenge. Henry looked at him and nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't disappear. "I hope you're right, kid. We're risking everything today." Chloe arrived shortly after, with an energy that seemed boundless. She wore a linen shirt and worn-out jeans, but her smile was what shone brightest. "They're coming," she exclaimed excitedly, looking out at the street from one of the windows. "My professor brought 2 critics from local food blogs, and several students are coming. Plus, the neighbors are curious. We're going to make it today, I swear." Henry took a deep breath. For a moment, it seemed he could hear his father's voice whispering in his ear, "Trust your people, son. Things work out when your heart is in the right place." As night fell, the diner began to fill up slowly. At first, the room was quiet, with customers talking in murmurs and curiously observing the humble but cozy atmosphere. The first table to be served was that of Chloe's professor and the food critics. Henry watched them nervously from the bar while Jack moved in the kitchen with the agility of a dancer. "This is the moment, kid," Henry said, peeking through the kitchen door. Everything depends on what comes out of here. Jack didn't respond, but Henry could see his firmness in the way he handled the pots and organized the plates with almost obsessive precision. He prepared the special short ribs, the same dish he had worked on with Henry the night before, and with careful hands decorated the plate in a simple yet elegant way. "This dish doesn't need frills," Jack murmured to himself. "It just needs to be real." When the first plate reached the critic's table, the ensuing silence was unbearable. Henry from the bar watched as the white-haired man took the first bite with a frown, as if analyzing every detail. Time seemed to stand still. Then, something unexpected happened. The critic slowly put down his fork, looked around with an expression Henry couldn't decipher, and finally smiled. "This dish," the man said, loud enough for others to hear, "is a work of art." The room, until then filled with nervous murmurs, erupted in a buzz of excitement and surprise. Other diners began to try their dishes with enthusiasm, and expressions of satisfaction were not long in coming. Mr. Henderson, the old man who had supported the diner from the start, raised his voice from a nearby table. "I told you, this place has magic. You don't find food like this anymore." Henry, behind the bar, let out a deep sigh. They had taken the first step. The night went on, and the tables never stopped being occupied. The diner, for the first time in years, was full. People talked and laughed, enjoyed every dish with excitement, and most importantly, paid happily, even leaving generous tips. In the kitchen, Jack continued to work tirelessly, but with a barely perceptible smile. Chloe ran in and out, helping to serve plates and talking to customers who wanted to know more about the young chef who had prepared such special food. "What did you do, Jack?" Henry asked, entering the kitchen during a brief respite. "It seems you've bewitched the whole neighborhood." Jack looked at him, tired but with a spark of pride in his eyes. "I just cooked the way I always should have," he replied, "without fear." Henry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. The boy had transformed not only the diner, but everyone who worked in it. At the end of the night, when the last customer had left, the diner fell silent again. But it was a different silence, one filled with satisfaction and hope. Chloe, exhausted but happy, collapsed into a chair and began to count the day's earnings. "Mr. Henry, it's a lot," she said, her eyes shining. "It won't be enough to pay off the whole debt, but it's a large part. It's a great start." Henry, who had slumped into a chair, smiled and ran a hand over his tired face. "We did it," he murmured. "We did it, kid." Jack came out of the kitchen, wiping his hands, and the three of them looked at each other with a knowing glance, as if a silent pact united them. "We're not done yet," Jack said, "but we'll get there, I promise." Henry looked at him and nodded slowly. "Yes, Jack, we'll get there, together." At that moment, for the first time in years, Henry felt that his father's diner was not only alive but was beating with strength again. "Come on, kids," he finally said, standing up. "Tomorrow will be an even better day." And so, as they turned off the lights and closed the door, the small diner remained in semi-darkness, but with an invisible light shining in every corner, the light of a future that, though uncertain, now seemed possible. The next morning brought a fresh air to the diner, as if the success of the previous night had purified the place. Henry, with a cup of coffee in hand, walked through the dining room, adjusting chairs and contemplating the tables. For the first time in years, he felt a strange calm inside. The bills weren't settled yet, but the feeling that they were moving forward gave him the strength to continue. In the kitchen, Jack worked with a serenity that contrasted with previous days. He chopped vegetables with precision, his movements agile and confident. Chloe entered with her backpack and a radiant smile. "You know what?" she said with enthusiasm. "They published the review from last night on the food blog and it's amazing." "A review?" Henry asked, frowning. "What does it say?" Chloe took out her phone and began to read aloud. "A hidden gem in the heart of the city, Emilio's Table has been reborn, thanks to a menu that honors tradition with an unexpected creative twist. Special mention to the young chef, Jack Miller, whose signature dish manages to connect the diner with the authentic spirit of American home cooking." The silence that followed was one of awe. Henry, with his eyes fixed on Chloe, let out a proud smile. "Kid, did you hear that?" he said, turning to Jack. Jack, who had stopped his knife for a moment, smiled slightly and nodded. "I didn't do it alone, Mr. Henry. We all worked for this." Chloe looked at them both with contagious enthusiasm. "This means more people will come to try the food. Jack's name is starting to get out there, and so is the diners." Henry didn't respond immediately, but inside he knew it was the beginning of something big. However, as life rarely allows moments of calm to last long, the bell on the door rang, announcing an unexpected visit. The figure that appeared made the air turn thick. Julian Croft, impeccably dressed with his usual haughty demeanor and a cold gaze that seemed to absorb the space. "Good morning," he said in a slow voice, letting each word float in the air. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Henry clenched his jaw and approached the counter with firm steps. "What do you want now?" he asked in a dry tone. Julian smiled with that arrogance that characterized him and, without asking permission, sat at one of the tables. "I'm not here to argue, Mr. Henry," he replied. "I've come to speak with Jack." Jack, who had come out of the kitchen upon hearing the voice, froze in the doorway. His eyes met Julian's, and for an instant, the shadow of the past seemed to envelop him again. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked in a tense voice. "Calm down, kid," Julian replied, extending his hands theatrically. "I'm just here to make you an offer." Henry frowned and crossed his arms, the distrust on his face evident. "What kind of offer?" "An opportunity," Julian said, turning to Jack. "I've seen your work, Jack. I know you managed to get some attention last night, but let's be honest. This place has no future. It's small, it's in ruins, and you deserve better." "Better?" Jack repeated coldly. "Like when you promised me success and then let me sink?" Julian's smile faded slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I made mistakes in the past," he said, "but I'm offering you a second chance. Come work with me. I'm opening a new restaurant in the most exclusive part of the city, and I want you to be my sous chef. You'll have all the resources, all the recognition, everything you've ever wanted." The silence in the diner was oppressive. Henry looked at Jack, trying to read his expression. Chloe, sitting at a nearby table, seemed to be holding her breath. Jack clenched his fists and held Julian's gaze firmly. "I don't want what you're offering," he finally replied, his voice low but firm. "Excuse me?" Julian said, visibly surprised. "I don't want to go back to a place where I'm nothing more than a tool." Jack continued, "This diner, it has given me something that all the money in the world can't buy. A purpose, a family, and a real second chance." Julian looked at him with disbelief, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're going to stay in this insignificant place?" He spat with disdain. "You're condemning yourself." "No," Jack replied with more firmness. "I'm choosing my own path. For the first time, I'm deciding for myself." Henry couldn't help but smile. The boy had grown beyond his fears. "I think you've heard what you wanted to hear, Mr. Croft," Henry said, taking a step forward. "I would appreciate it if you would leave my diner." Julian stood up abruptly, his wounded pride evident in his expression. "You'll regret this," he said harshly. "Opportunities like this don't come twice." "I already had a second chance," Jack replied, "and I'm taking it." As Julian left, slamming the door behind him, Henry placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, kid," he said in a soft voice. "What you did today. Not just anyone does that." Jack, visibly moved, nodded in silence. Chloe approached with an excited smile. "Now, Jack, what's coming next is going to be big. I promise you." Jack looked up, and for the first time his eyes didn't reflect fear or doubt. He had left the shadow of his past behind, and before him opened a future that he himself was building. "Let's get to work," he said finally. "This is just the beginning." The sun was setting slowly over the city, painting the worn facades of the buildings in orange hues. Henry's diner was shining in a different way that afternoon. Customers came and went. The tables were occupied, and although they couldn't yet consider themselves a resounding success, the constant murmur of voices and laughter felt like a balm in that place that for years had been on the verge of closing. In the kitchen, Jack worked with a dedication that transformed him. The traditional recipes Henry had taught him now coexisted with the young chef's creative touches. The balance between tradition and modernity was beginning to become the diner's signature. "Mr. Henry," Chloe shouted from the door, phone in hand and eyes shining with excitement. "You're not going to believe this. A critic from one of the biggest newspapers in the city wants to come tomorrow." Henry, who was drying a glass behind the counter, looked at her, wide-eyed. "A big paper?" he repeated in disbelief. "Are you sure about that?" "Of course I am," Chloe replied. "The review on the local blogs made some noise, and now they want to come meet Jack and try the menu. This could be our big break." Henry ran a hand through his graying hair and carefully placed the glass on the counter. He felt excitement mixed with an impossible-to-ignore nervousness. They were moving faster than he had ever imagined. "Kid," Henry said, peeking into the kitchen, "did you hear that? A major critic is coming tomorrow." Jack, who was focused on adjusting a sauce, looked up calmly. "I heard, Mr. Henry. We'll be ready," he replied with confidence, though his voice had a slight hint of concern. That night, when the last customer left and the diner fell silent, Jack stayed alone in the kitchen. Henry, tired, patted him on the shoulder before going up to his small apartment. "Don't work too hard, kid. You need to rest." "Yes, Mr. Henry," Jack replied with a slight smile. But he didn't rest. Instead, he sat at the table with a notebook and began to write and adjust recipes, as if trying to perfect every last detail. The news that a major critic was coming to the diner had awakened a whirlwind of emotions in him. For the first time in a long time, he felt visible, as if all his effort was finally paying off. However, as he reviewed his ideas, a voice he thought was buried began to whisper in his ear. It was the voice of Julian Croft, with its cold and condescending tone. "Do you think you can escape who you are, Jack? You'll always be the kid who failed when it mattered most." Jack gripped the pencil tightly, feeling the shadow of his past catching up to him again. He remembered the night of the accident that changed everything, the call he didn't answer, the crash that took his family, and the career he abandoned afterward. Guilt had consumed him for years, and although Henry's diner had given him a second chance, there were moments when the weight returned, suffocating. Suddenly, the sound of his phone vibrating on the table snapped him out of his thoughts. He picked it up and saw an unexpected message. It was Julian Croft. "It's not too late, Jack. My offer still stands. You can come back with me and stop wasting your time in that place. The world needs to see your talent. Think about it." Jack placed the phone on the table as if it were burning his hands. Those words hit him right where it hurt the most. What if Julian was right? What if he was wasting his time in a place that would never be more than small and modest? Didn't he deserve to aspire to something more? He put his face in his hands and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. The doubts were eating at him. But then he remembered something. Henry's face when he first tasted Emilio's signature dish, Chloe's smile when she got the review on the blog, and Mrs. Gable's words, "Families don't always come from blood." This small, modest place had given him more than any luxury restaurant he had ever worked in. Here, he wasn't a tool. He wasn't just another name on a list. He was someone valuable. "No," Jack murmured, standing up firmly. "I'm not going back." He turned off his phone and went out of the kitchen for some fresh air. The night wind hit his face, cold but comforting. Looking at the diner's windows, he saw his own reflection and smiled sadly. He was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Jack arrived at the diner earlier than usual. Henry found him preparing ingredients with more precision than ever. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" Henry said, looking at him suspiciously. "Not much," Jack replied without stopping his work. "I want everything to be perfect today." Henry watched the boy for a moment and nodded with pride. "It will be, kid. It will be." When the critic arrived that afternoon, the diner was filled with a palpable energy. Henry, though nervous, greeted him with the kindness that had always characterized him. "Welcome," he said, shaking his hand. "I hope you enjoy your visit." The critic, an older man with round glasses and a notebook in hand, smiled professionally and settled into the central table. He observed the place attentively, and when Jack came out of the kitchen to present his special dish, a short rib with carefully selected ingredients and an impeccable presentation, the silence was absolute. The critic tasted the first bite and slowly put his spoon down on the plate. Henry's and Chloe's hearts seemed to stop. "This," the critic said with a genuine smile, "is not just a dish, it's a story. Congratulations, young man. You have a talent that deserves to be recognized." Jack took a deep breath, feeling the doubts from the night before vanish like smoke. He had chosen his own path, and for the first time he hadn't failed. Henry from the bar let out a smile and whispered, "We did it, kid. We did it." The news of the special dish's success and the good review from the food critic spread like wildfire among regular customers and new visitors to the diner. Emilio's table was beginning to become a known place, a small hidden treasure in the heart of the city. The tables were no longer empty, and the voices of satisfaction replaced the melancholic silences that had filled the place for years. But as often happens when you feel that everything is starting to go well, fate has cruel ways of testing one's strength. On Thursday afternoon, while Henry was doing the accounts at the counter, Art entered the diner. The expression on his face left no room for doubt. He did not bring good news. "Henry," Art said in a grave voice, placing a paper on the bar. "It's the court order. I can't give you any more time. You have until noon tomorrow to pay the full debt, or the diner will be seized." The world seemed to stop for an instant. Henry took the paper with trembling hands and read the cold words that confirmed the inevitable. The recent success had not been enough. Their time had run out. "Art," Henry said in a broken voice, "we're starting to get this off the ground. Just give me one more week. I promise I'll pay you." Art shook his head with an expression of genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Henry. It's not up to me. Those are the rules." Jack and Chloe, listening from the kitchen door, felt the air grow heavier. Henry's expression said it all. The end was near. "What are we going to do?" Chloe asked with a trembling voice, approaching the counter. Henry dropped the paper and sank onto a chair, running his hands over his face. For the first time, the shadow of defeat reappeared in his eyes. "I don't know, Chloe. I don't know." That night, the diner closed earlier than usual. Henry stayed alone in the dining room, the account book open in front of him, staring at the numbers as if they could magically change. Jack appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands with a cloth, and sat across from him. "Mr. Henry," Jack said in a soft voice, "we can't give up now. We've come too far." Henry slowly looked up, tired. "And what do you propose, kid? Tomorrow at noon, it's all over. There's no time." Jack was silent for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "We can make one last bet," he finally replied. "Let's prepare something special for tomorrow. Let's do a takeout sale. We'll use what we have, prepare our best recipes, and get people to come and support us. If we don't make it, at least we'll have tried." Henry looked at him with disbelief. "A special sale in one day, Jack? That's crazy." "Yes, it is," Jack replied firmly. "But everything we've done so far has been too. This diner doesn't deserve to die without putting up one last fight." Jack's words seemed to ignite something inside Henry. He looked at the young chef, whose gaze reflected no fear or doubt, but pure determination. "All right," he finally said, standing up. "Let's do it, but we'll need help." "I'll take care of spreading the word," Chloe said, appearing from the doorway with her phone in hand. "I have contacts, friends, and neighbors who can help us bring in customers. And I'll do what I can with what we have," Jack said. "We don't need luxuries, just flavor, what this place represents." Henry looked at them both with a mix of pride and gratitude. He wasn't alone. Even though time was short, they had a plan. "Then let's work," he said with a deep sigh. "It's our last chance." That night was a flurry of frantic work. The kitchen of Emilio's table had never been so alive. Jack worked with surgical precision, preparing doughs, sauces, and stews, while Chloe made calls, sent messages, and put up improvised posters around the neighborhood. Henry, for his part, helped with the most basic tasks, but on his face there was a calm he hadn't felt in years. They were fighting until the end. When the sun began to rise, the three of them stopped for a moment, tired but satisfied. On the counter were dozens of packed food containers, each with handwritten labels by Chloe. "This has to work," Henry murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "It will," Jack replied, though inside he knew everything depended on that day. The morning unfolded like a hurricane. The first customers began to arrive as soon as the clock struck 8. Neighbors, Chloe's friends, Henry's old customer everyone wanted to help in some way. The special sale was underway. "2 stews to go," Chloe shouted from the counter, handing bags to an elderly couple. "Here are 4 more orders," added Mrs. Gable, who had appeared that morning to help with the growing crowd. Henry, running between the cash register and the tables, couldn't believe what he was seeing. People kept coming, young students, entire families, and even some customers who had tried the diner days before came to support them. "Thanks for helping us," Henry shouted with a smile. "Every purchase gets us one step closer." As the clock ticked on, the tension grew. Noon was approaching, and with it, Art's final visit. At 11:50, Jack came out of the kitchen, his hands stained with sauce, and looked out at the crowd. "Did we make it?" he asked, almost out of breath. Henry, with a handful of bills, looked at him with a tired smile. "I don't know, kid, but we did what we had to do." Just then, the door opened. Art entered with the same serious expression as always, but upon seeing the full diner and the bustle of people, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Henry," he said, approaching the counter, "it's time." Henry took the money, counted it with trembling hands, and handed it over. "Here it is," he said in a firm voice. "Not all of it, but it's the biggest part. I promised you I would fight, and here's the proof." Art took the money, counted it in silence, and for the first time, barely smiled. "I wouldn't expect less from you, Henry," he said, putting the bills in his wallet. "You surprised me today. You have one more week to settle the rest." Henry let out a sigh of relief and looked at Jack, who was smiling from the other side of the counter. They had won one more battle. "We did it, kid," Henry murmured with restrained tears. "I don't know how, but we did it." And as the last customer left the diner and the noise began to fade, Henry and Jack looked at each other with a knowing glance. They knew the road ahead was still long, but that afternoon they had shown that nothing was impossible when you fought with your heart. The afternoon slowly fell over the neighborhood, and with it, exhaustion settled into the bodies of Henry, Jack, and Chloe. The special sale had ended, and although the money wasn't enough to clear the debt, they had managed to buy time, one more week. For Henry, that small respite was a victory. For Jack, it meant something much deeper, a vote of confidence he had never had before. "Are we closing for today?" Chloe asked, rubbing her hands and collapsing into a chair in the dining room. Henry nodded, leaving the account book on the counter and rubbing the back of his neck with a tired gesture. "Yes, kid, we've done enough for today." Chloe looked at Jack, who was meticulously cleaning one of the kitchen surfaces with a damp cloth. The young man didn't seem tired, but rather lost in thought. "Are you okay, Jack?" she asked gently. Jack paused for a moment, resting his hands on the counter. He slowly turned his head and barely smiled. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, but his voice lacked firmness. Chloe frowned and studied him attentively, as if she could read him through his silence. In the end, she decided not to press. She took her backpack and, with a wave goodbye, walked out the door. Henry, who had been watching everything from the back, approached Jack. "What's wrong, kid?" he asked in a calm voice. "Since we finished, you seem like you're in another world." Jack took a deep breath and left the cloth on the table. He sat in one of the chairs next to Henry, lowering his gaze to his hands, stained with flour and sauce. "Julian texted me again," he finally said in a thin voice. Henry felt his heart skip a beat. He knew that Shadow hadn't disappeared yet. "And what did he want now?" he asked, trying to sound calm. "The same as always," Jack replied without looking up. "He wants me to go work for him. He says I can have everything I ever wanted. Success, money, recognition. He's offering to make me his sous chef at one of the best restaurants in the city." The silence was dense. Henry looked at him with a mix of worry and sadness. He knew Jack deserved more than this small diner could offer, but he also knew what that world meant, a life full of pressure, loneliness, and arrogance. "And what are you thinking of doing?" Henry asked in a soft voice, though he struggled to hide the tension. Jack finally looked up. His eyes were full of doubt and something else, fear of making the wrong decision. "I don't know," he answered with sincerity. "A part of me wants to accept. It would be the opportunity of a lifetime. I could prove to Julian that he was wrong, that I am capable." Henry watched him in silence, letting the young man's words flow. "But another part of me," Jack continued, his voice breaking, "another part of me feels that if I leave, I'll be betraying what we've achieved here. You trusted me. Chloe trusted me. Mrs. Gable did too. This place gave me back something I never thought I'd recover, the love for cooking, for my craft, for myself." Henry leaned toward him, resting his elbows on the table. "Listen, Jack," he said in a firm but fatherly voice. "Life always puts us in situations where we have to choose. I'm not going to tell you what to do because I'm not your owner or your father. But I want you to think about something. Success isn't always where it shines brightest. Sometimes, success is going to bed every night, knowing you did something good, something that matters." Jack looked at him with glassy eyes. "Do you think this place matters?" he asked in a low voice. Henry smiled tenderly, the smile of a man who has lived too much and learned to value the simple things. "Of course it matters," he replied. "Because here, we don't just make food, Jack. We give something back to people, warmth, affection, and a piece of what it means to have a home. My father used to say that a well-made dish not only feeds the body but also the soul, and that's what you do in that kitchen. Don't ever lose that wherever you decide to go." Jack remained silent, processing those words. He looked around the diner, the polished tables, the smell of old wood and spices, the memories that were beginning to fill every corner. This humble place had become his refuge, his rebirth. "Thank you, Mr. Henry," he murmured finally with a small smile. "You've given me much more than you can imagine." Henry patted his shoulder firmly and stood up. "Don't worry, kid. Take your time to decide. But I'll tell you one more thing. If you leave, I'll be proud of you. And if you stay, even prouder." Jack let out a small laugh and nodded. The decision still weighed on his chest, but something inside him was beginning to clear up. That night, Jack went up to the small room Henry had offered him weeks ago. He took out his phone and looked at the last message from Julian. He could accept that offer and return to a world where everything was bright but cold, where his talent would be seen but not valued. Or he could stay at the small diner, fighting alongside the people who had believed in him. He took a deep breath and, with a racing pulse, wrote a reply. "Thank you for your offer, Julian, but not this time. I've found something here that you can never offer me." He turned off the phone and let out a deep sigh. He had made his decision. Outside, the night stretched peacefully over the neighborhood, but inside the small room, Jack felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he had chosen his own path. Dawn illuminated the windows of Emilio's table with a soft, golden light. Henry, as usual, came down to the diner early, but something in the air felt different. Perhaps it was the serene silence that enveloped the room, or perhaps the certainty that after so many battles, something had changed. Jack, punctual as always, was already in the kitchen, organizing his utensils and lining up the day's ingredients. The decision he had made the night before his rejection of Julian had lifted a weight from his soul that he had carried for years. He had chosen himself, and with that choice, his mind was calm, and his hands were steadier than ever. "Kid," Henry said, leaning on the doorway, "did you sleep at all, or did you work all night again?" Jack barely smiled, not looking up from the knife he was sharpening. "I slept enough, Mr. Henry," he replied in a serene voice. "Today is going to be a good day." Henry looked at him with a mix of amazement and pride. This young man who had arrived on a rainy night with a lost gaze and slumped shoulders was now a different man. He wasn't just a talented chef, he was someone who had faced his shadows and decided to stay and fight alongside them. "Of course it is, kid," Henry replied, smiling. "Today is going to be a great day." Mid-morning, the news that Chloe had announced days earlier came true. The most important local newspaper had published an article about the diner. Chloe ran in with the newspaper in hand, waving the pages as if they were a trophy. "Look at this," she shouted, leaving the copy on one of the tables. "We're on the front page of the food section." Henry adjusted his glasses and read aloud. "Emilio's Table, a restaurant where tradition and reinvention meet, with the mastery of young chef Jack Miller and the perseverance of Henry. This little corner has re-emerged as a symbol of second chances." For a moment, no one said anything. Henry put the newspaper on the table and looked at Jack with teary eyes. "Kid, I told you we'd do it." Chloe, excited, hugged Jack by the shoulders and said, "I told you too, we did it." Jack moved, smiled, but beyond the joy, what he felt was peace. He didn't need Julian's recognition or the luxurious kitchens he had once imagined. This small diner, with its worn tables and its smell of spices, was the place where he had finally found his purpose. That afternoon the diner was full. Neighbors, new and old customers, and old friends filled the tables with laughter and conversation. The news of the article had spread quickly, and now everyone wanted to try the famous short ribs and meet the young chef everyone was talking about. Mr. Henderson, one of the first to believe in the place, entered with a smile and a new cane. He greeted Henry from the door and sat at his favorite table. "Henry, this is what I was telling you," he exclaimed. "I knew your diner would go back to what it was." "Thanks, Mr. Henderson," Henry replied, serving him a coffee with a smile that came from the heart. "You never stopped believing in us." From the kitchen, Jack watched everything through the small window that overlooked the dining room. He saw how the diner had transformed into a home full of life. Chloe ran from one side to the other, delivering dishes, and Mrs. Gable smiled as she helped with the bills. Everything flowed like a perfect machine. But it wasn't just a business, it was a family. During a moment of respite, Henry entered the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe watching Jack. "Kid, you got a minute?" he asked. Jack put the pan aside and nodded. "Sure, Mr. Henry." Henry looked at him seriously, but with the gleam of someone about to say something important. "Look, Jack, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for this place. When you arrived that night, I had lost all hope. You taught me that it doesn't matter how many times you fall, what matters is how you get up." Jack looked at him, speechless but with moist eyes. "This diner isn't just mine anymore, Jack," Henry continued. "It's yours too. I want you to be my partner. Half of what we make will be yours, because without you, this place wouldn't exist." Jack looked at him, completely surprised. "A partner," he murmured. "But Mr. Henry the First—" "No buts," Henry interrupted, smiling. "You deserve it. This place is as much yours as it is mine. We're a team now, kid." Jack took a deep breath and extended a trembling hand. Henry shook it firmly, like a sacred pact. "Thank you, Mr. Henry," Jack said, his voice breaking. "I promise I won't let you down." "I know, Jack," Henry replied in a firm voice. "I know." That night, when the last customer left and the lights went out, Henry and Jack sat at one of the tables in the dining room, Chloe and Mrs. Gable had already left, and the diner was silent, but a silence full of promises. "You know, kid," Henry said, looking at the old photograph of his father hanging on the wall, "I think Emilio would be proud of us." Jack smiled and nodded. "I'm sure he is, Mr. Henry." They both remained silent, observing the empty but history-filled dining room, full of love and life. That night, for the first time in a long time, Henry didn't turn off the lights with resignation, but with hope. They had fought, they had fallen, and they had risen together. The small diner that was on the verge of disappearing was now a symbol of second chances, of love, and of perseverance. And as they left and closed the door, Henry looked up at the starry sky and murmured in a low voice, "Thanks, old man. We did it." The next day's dawn was not like the others. The sun seemed to shine brighter, and the fresh air carried with it a tranquility that was hard to explain. For Henry, it was as if the world was finally giving back everything it had once taken from him. He came down the stairs from his small apartment with lighter movements than usual. When he reached the diner's dining room, he found it neat and clean as always, but something had changed. It was now a place full of life, a home where people found warmth and purpose. Jack was already in the kitchen, as was his habit. The rhythmic sound of the knife on the cutting board and the aroma of chicken broth filled the place in an almost magical way. When Henry saw him, he couldn't help but smile. "Did you sleep at all, kid?" he asked with that fatherly tone that had become natural between them. Jack looked up, his gaze serene and a discreet smile on his face. "Yes, Mr. Henry, today will be a good day." Henry nodded and sat at one of the tables in the dining room, looking around with satisfaction. Emilio's table had been reborn, not just as a diner, but as a refuge for everyone who entered it. A couple of hours later, Mrs. Gable arrived with her immaculate apron and a bag of freshly baked rolls. "Good morning," she greeted with her soft, motherly voice. "I brought rolls today. No customer can resist a good roll with their coffee." "Thanks, Mrs. Gable," Henry replied, helping her leave the bag on the counter. "You always know what we need." Mrs. Gable smiled and looked toward the kitchen, where Jack remained focused. "That boy has the hands of an angel," she said tenderly. "I don't know what would have become of this place if you hadn't found him." Henry looked at her and nodded thoughtfully. It wasn't just luck, Mrs. Gable. I think fate wanted our lives to cross. He needed us, and we needed him. Mrs. Gable smiled and began to set the tables, humming an old song that filled the diner with a nostalgic and comforting melody. Shortly after, Chloe came running in as always, with her backpack and a coffee in hand. "Good morning," she exclaimed, leaving her backpack in a corner. "I come with good news." "Let's hear it, kid. Surprise us," Henry replied with a gesture. "The newspaper published a second note about us," she said, waving her phone. "They talked about how the diner combines tradition with a fresh, creative touch. They called us a place that not only feeds the body, but the heart." Jack came out of the kitchen at that moment, listening attentively. Henry took the phone and read the article aloud, his voice breaking slightly at the end. "Emilio's Table is not just a diner. It's proof that second chances exist, and that when you fight with your heart, any dream can be reborn." Chloe looked at him with shining eyes. "This means more people will come, Henry. We're going to need more hands to help." Henry nodded with a smile. "Let them come, kid. This place is ready to receive them." At noon, the diner was full. Customers entered with curiosity and left with satisfied smiles, leaving generous tips and words of thanks. Neighbors, entire families, and even young students had become regular customers. The aroma of Jack's stews and Emilio's recipes enveloped everyone, making the place a corner full of memories and warmth. At one of the tables, a group of children from the local orphanage, invited by Henry, enjoyed a plate of stew with rice and warm rolls. Jack watched them from the kitchen with a soft smile. Seeing their joy reminded him of the days when his mother cooked for him and his sister. "Why are you doing this?" Chloe asked, approaching with curiosity. Jack looked at her and replied with sincerity, "Because someone has to. Food has the power to heal and to bring people together. If I can give them a moment of happiness, then it's worth it." Chloe looked at him with admiration. "You're a good man, Jack. What you do here is bigger than you think." He smiled and returned to his tasks, with the certainty that he was where he was supposed to be. At the end of the day, when the diner closed, Henry, Jack, Chloe, and Mrs. Gable sat together at one of the tables. The exhaustion was evident, but so was the satisfaction. They had survived everything, the debts, the doubts, and the shadows of the past. Henry raised his coffee cup with a solemn gesture. "To you, kids," he said, "for bringing life back to this place, and for reminding me that it's never too late to start over." Chloe raised her cup with a smile. "To the family we choose," she added. Jack, moved, raised his cup too and murmured, "To Emilio, for teaching us that true cooking is not in the recipes, but in the heart." Mrs. Gable, with teary eyes, smiled and said, "And to you, for proving that second chances are real." That night, when Henry turned off the diner's lights, he did so with a heart full of gratitude. He looked at the photograph of his father hanging on the wall and smiled. "We did it, old man," he murmured in a low voice. "We didn't do it alone, but we did it." And so, as silence enveloped the small diner, Emilio's Table remained as an eternal symbol of struggle, hope, and love. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how many times we fall. What matters is how we get up and the people we choose to get up with us. The next morning was as bright as the previous ones, but something in the air had a special lightness, as if the universe were aligned with the little corner of Emilio's Table. The recent success and the transformation of the diner seemed like a distant but tangible dream, one built on effort, struggle, and above all, a deep sense of community. Shortly before noon, the bell on the door rang. Henry, who was behind the counter counting the day's first earnings, looked up with a mechanical gesture. When he saw who entered, his smile froze. It was Marilyn, his ex-wife. Time had been kind to her. Although her once dark hair now showed streaks of grey, she was as elegant as ever. She wore a light coat and held a small purse with both hands, as if it were a shield. Her gaze was a mix of nostalgia, regret, and silent pride. "Hello, Henry," she said in a soft voice. Henry took a few seconds to react. Finally, he straightened his back and replied dryly but politely, "Marilyn, I didn't expect to see you here." She smiled faintly and scanned the place. The dining room was full of life, the tables occupied, the murmurs of customers, and the aroma of American comfort food enveloped her with a warmth she didn't expect. "It feels different," she commented, avoiding his eyes. Beautiful, I'd say. We try, Henry replied with a mix of pride and distrust. To what do I owe your visit? Marilyn let out a sigh and looked around for a chair. Henry pointed to a table, and they both sat facing each other. For a moment, they said nothing. The weight of the years, of what was lost and what was left unsaid, floated in the air like a ghost. I read about the diner in the newspaper, Marilyn finally said. About you, and about Jack. I couldn't help but be curious, not just about the success, but about you. About me? Henry asked, a bitter edge to his voice. You weren't so curious when I lost everything. I know, Marilyn replied, looking down, ashamed. You're right, she admitted. When you lost everything, I didn't know how to handle it. I got scared. I felt trapped, and I decided to leave. I tried to convince myself it was your fault, but over time I understood it wasn't. We both failed, Henry. Henry looked at her in silence. The wound of abandonment was still there, though less sharp. Her words, years later, didn't sound like an excuse, but like a genuine attempt at reconciliation. Why are you here now, Marilyn? He asked, softer this time. Because I wanted to see you, she replied with sincerity. And because I needed to tell you that I'm proud of what you've done here. You didn't just revive this place. You revived yourself. Henry felt a lump in his throat. For years he had lived with the weight of guilt, believing that his failure was what destroyed his marriage, his life. But hearing those words, even if they came late, gave him a strange comfort. Thanks, he finally said in a low voice, although I didn't do it alone. Marilyn smiled tenderly. I read about Jack. That young man seems special. He is, Henry replied with pride. He came when I least expected it, and somehow he saved me. I don't know what would have become of this place without him. Marilyn looked at him and nodded slowly. I'm glad to know you found someone who believed in you. We all need that. For a moment, they both smiled. It wasn't a smile full of love or complicity as before, but a smile of peace, of closing a chapter that had been left open for too long. I didn't come to ask you for anything, Henry, Marilyn said, standing up slowly. I just wanted to see you and tell you that I admire you. I'm glad you're okay. I am, Henry replied firmly. Better than I've been in a long time. She nodded and before leaving handed him a card. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. Henry took the card but said nothing. He watched her leave through the door and linger for a moment on the street, looking at the diner's sign before continuing on her way. When the door closed, Henry remained seated in silence. Are you okay, Mr. Henry? Jack asked, appearing from the kitchen with a mix of worry and curiosity. Henry looked up as if waking from a dream. He looked at him and smiled. Yes, kid, he replied in a firm voice. I'm fine. Jack nodded and returned to the kitchen, but not without casting one last sideways glance. Chloe, who had witnessed everything from the counter, approached with a mischievous smile. And who was the elegant lady? She asked with curiosity. A ghost from the past, he replied, putting the card in his pocket. One that I can finally let go of. Chloe smiled, as if satisfied with the answer, and returned to her tasks. Henry, for his part, stood up and observed the diner full of people. He felt, for the first time, that he had closed a cycle. That night, when the last customer left and the lights went out, Henry went up to his small apartment and sat by the window. He took out Marilyn's card and looked at it for a moment before putting it in the table drawer. He looked up at the starry sky and murmured with a serene smile, Thanks, old man. In the end, what I lost helped me find what really matters. And for the first time in many years, Henry didn't feel like he was missing anything. The next morning arrived with a fresh breeze that seeped through the diner's windows. The city was waking up, but at Emilio's table, the day had a special glow. The familiar aromas of fresh coffee, simmering stews, and the soft sound of plates being arranged created a comforting atmosphere. It was an ordinary day, but extraordinary in its simplicity. Henry, with his apron already tied and a cup of coffee in hand, observed the dining room from the counter. The small place, full of life and laughter, was exactly as his father had dreamed it. The tables were occupied by young families from the neighborhood and even some suited customers looking for a break from the city's pace. Mr. Henry, Chloe shouted, rushing in from the street. The invitations for the community lunch have arrived. Henry took one of the flyers she handed him and read it aloud with a smile. A special meal for those who need it most at Emilio's table, because food unites, and second chances are for everyone. Chloe smiled and added with enthusiasm, "It was Jack's idea. He said we should give back to the community everything it has given us." Henry looked toward the kitchen, where Jack, with his flour-stained apron, was kneading dough with the concentration of an artist. He watched him with pride and an emotion that was hard to contain. The boy had changed his life, and the lives of everyone who walked through that door. "This kid never ceases to amaze me," Henry murmured, smiling. Chloe looked at him mischievously. "He's a bit like you, don't you think? Stubborn but with a good heart." Henry chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. "Maybe." He looked out at the bustling diner, a thought striking him. "You know, when I had money, I used to write checks to charities. It was easy, impersonal. I thought that was giving back. But this," he said, gesturing to the kitchen where Jack was working, "this feels real. This is what my father meant." Henry shook his head, though he couldn't help but let out a small laugh. "Yeah, kid, I suppose so." As evening fell, the diner closed early, but not to rest. Jack and Henry worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing stews and sauces for the special dinner they had, organized a free meal for a group of children from a nearby orphanage. Henry, remembering his father's words, wanted this place to be a home for those who didn't have one. "Why do you do this, Henry?" Jack asked while stirring a pot of stew. "You could rest, enjoy the success, but you're always thinking of others." Henry, who was chopping onions, looked up and smiled nostalgically. "My father always said that a diner isn't just a business. It's a place where people come to heal, to find each other, to feel that someone cares about them. I inherited this place, but the legacy I want to leave is my own." Jack nodded slowly. Now he understood what this place meant. It was no longer just a kitchen or a diner. It was a symbol of struggle, of love for tradition, and of second chances. When the children arrived, accompanied by the orphanage's caregivers, their laughter and curious glances filled the diner with a special energy. Chloe greeted them with a warm smile and guided them to the tables, decorated with clean tablecloths and simple but beautiful flowers. "Welcome," Henry exclaimed from the center of the room. "Today, Emilio's table is your home. Eat, laugh, and enjoy." The children applauded excitedly and quickly sat down. Jack and Henry began to serve them the plates with care, as if preparing something sacred. The stew, the rice, the warm rolls, and the glasses of lemonade seemed to shine under the light of the place. "This is so good," exclaimed a child with a full mouth. "I want more rolls." Jack laughed from the kitchen and with a quick gesture came out with a basket of fresh rolls. "For everyone," he said with enthusiasm, handing them out. Mrs. Gable, sitting in a corner, watched the scene with tears in her eyes. She approached Henry, who was standing by the door, watching the children with a serene smile. "Henry, you're doing something beautiful," she said in a soft voice. "Your father would be so proud." He swallowed and nodded slowly. "Thanks, Mrs. Gable, but I'm not doing it alone. Jack, Chloe, we're all part of this." She took his hand tenderly. "Yes, but it was you who didn't give up. That's what makes the difference." At the end of the meal, when the children said goodbye with laughter and hugs, the diner fell silent. Jack, Chloe, Henry, and Mrs. Gable sat at one of the tables with steaming cups of coffee in their hands. "We did a good thing today," Jack said, looking at the empty but memory-filled dining room. "Yes, kid," Henry replied, smiling. "Something worthwhile." Chloe, ever restless, took out a notebook and began to scribble. "What are you doing now?" Henry asked. "Thinking about the next event," she replied with a smile. "We have to keep growing, right?" Everyone laughed, and Henry shook his head tenderly. "With you guys here, I don't know what will become of this place, but what I do know is that Emilio's legacy is more alive than ever." Jack nodded, looking toward the kitchen. That was his home. It had been since that rainy night when Henry let him in, and it always would be. "Sometimes," Jack murmured, almost to himself, "second chances come to us in the most unexpected ways." Henry heard him and, raising his coffee cup, added, "Yes, but the important thing is to know how to take them." That night, when Henry turned off the diner's lights, he stood for a moment at the door, looking at the worn but history-filled sign. Emilio's table shone in the darkness, not because of its lights, but because of everything it represented. "Thanks, old man," he whispered, looking up at the starry sky. "Your legacy is in good hands." He closed the door with a smile, sure that this place would live forever, not just on the tables full of food and laughter, but in the hearts of those who found in it a refuge and a second chance. It was a perfect afternoon. The sky was clear, and the sun gently gilded the facades of the old houses in the neighborhood. Emilio's table was full of life and joy. Every table was occupied. The murmur of diners and the sound of plates and cutlery created a symphony of everyday life that felt like a gift. It was an ordinary day, but for Henry and Jack, it was the best of all. From the kitchen door, Jack observed the dining room with a calm smile. The customers enjoyed the dishes that he and Henry had perfected with love and dedication. In every expression of satisfaction, in every word of thanks, Jack felt that his path, though thorny, had been worth it. Chloe ran from one side to the other with the agility that characterized her, smiling at customers, taking orders, and joking with the neighborhood regulars, who already considered her an essential part of the place. Mrs. Gable, always present, supervised the tables with a tenderness that radiated maternal warmth. "Iced tea for table 4, Chloe," Jack shouted from the kitchen as he finished plating an impeccable stew. "Coming right up, chef," Chloe replied with a teasing smile, making Jack shake his head in amusement. Henry, from behind the counter, watched the scene with a pride he couldn't hide. The diner, his legacy and his father's, was more alive than ever. The sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the walls decorated with old photographs, and in one of them, the portrait of Emilio smiled as if he were present in every corner. "Everything good, Mr. Henry?" asked a regular customer, Mr. Henderson, who was sitting at his favorite table enjoying his stew. Henry smiled and nodded. "Everything's perfect, Mr. Henderson. Better than I ever imagined." In the afternoon, when the lunch rush began to die down, Henry gathered Jack, Chloe, and Mrs. Gable at one of the tables. He brought with him a cheap but meaningful bottle of wine and 4 glasses. "What are we celebrating today, Mr. Henry?" Chloe asked with curiosity. Henry, with a warm smile, poured himself a glass and looked at them one by one. "Today, we celebrate the future," he replied. "This place is not just a diner, it's a home, a refuge, a symbol that second chances exist, and you are all part of this, just as much as I am." Jack looked at him, moved, while Chloe smiled with excitement, and Mrs. Gable nodded with tears in her eyes. "I want to tell you something," Henry continued. "I don't know what would have become of me if, on that rainy night, Jack hadn't shown up at my door. But now I know that life isn't about the times we fall, but the times we get up. This place gave me back my purpose, and you all gave me back my faith." "You believed in us too, Mr. Henry," Jack replied in a firm and emotional voice. "Thanks to that, we are here." Henry raised his glass, and everyone did the same. "To Emilio's table," Henry said in a solemn voice, "to the legacy we built together, and to all those who are yet to come." "Cheers!" they all exclaimed in unison, clinking their glasses. That night, when the diner closed, Henry and Jack went out together to the small sidewalk in front of the establishment. The neighborhood lights flickered, and the silence of the night was only interrupted by a distant dog's bark or the echo of faraway laughter. "You know, Mr. Henry," Jack said, leaning on the doorframe, "I never thought I would find a place like this." Henry looked at him and replied softly, "I never thought someone like you would come along. This diner needs you as much as you needed it." Jack smiled, looking at the worn-out sign that still hung above the door. Emilio's table was no longer just a name, it was a symbol, a home where stories of struggle, hope, and redemption had come to life. "What's next?" Jack asked with curiosity. Henry looked toward the dark horizon and replied with serenity, "Keep moving forward, kid, day by day, helping who we can, taking care of this place, and honoring its history. Because this, Jack, this has no end." Jack nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that the future no longer weighed on him. He had found his place, a place where he belonged. "Let's go home, Mr. Henry," he finally said. "Yes, kid, let's go home," Henry replied, turning off the diner's lights for the last time that day. As they closed the door and darkness fell, Emilio's table grew silent, yet it was brimming with life, promises, and love. Because even as the days pass and people come and go, this little place will forever stand as an eternal symbol of second chances. And that, my friends, is what life wants to teach us. Sometimes, the greatest strangers become our family. Sometimes, when we think we have lost everything, that is precisely when life is preparing to give us its most wonderful gifts. Henry once thought that 53 was too late to start over. Jack once believed he could never overcome the pain of his past. But they were wrong. We can all be wrong when we think of ourselves that way. Have you ever felt like Henry, when everything seems to turn its back on you, when those you trusted betray you, when your dreams seem to shatter? I believe every one of us has been through moments like that. But this story is here to tell us never give up. Not because everything will always be easy, but because even in the darkest of nights, there is always a light waiting for us. Jack found his light in Henry's small kitchen. Henry found his purpose by helping Jack. Chloe found her true passion. Mrs. Gable found a new family to love. And the most amazing part, they found all of this by giving. Henry gave Jack a place to stay. Jack gave Henry hope. Chloe gave everyone her enthusiasm. Mrs. Gable gave them a mother's love. Life has a wonderful way of repaying what we give out. Not always immediately, not always in the way we expect, but it will come. It always does. So, wherever you are in your life, whether you feel like Henry in his darkest days, or like Jack as he wandered the streets, or are simply searching for your own meaning, please, remember that your story is not over. Maybe right now, somewhere, there is someone who needs your help. Maybe there is an opportunity waiting for you to open the door. Maybe there is a passion inside you waiting to be awakened. Emilio's Table is more than just a restaurant. It is a testament to the fact that magical things can happen when we don't give up, when we open our hearts to one another, and when we believe that every new day holds endless possibilities. The story of Henry and Jack may have ended here, but their story, the story of hope, of kindness, of second chances, will continue forever, in every meal served with love, in every person who decides not to give up, in every moment we choose to believe in the good. And who knows, maybe the next story we tell will be yours. Thank you for listening to today's story. If it touched your heart, please leave a like to let me know. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more meaningful stories. And don't forget to share this with the people you love. Who knows, they might need to hear this message. Comment below and let me know what you thought of the story and what city you're watching from. I always love reading your shares. See you in the next video. And remember, every day is a chance to rewrite your own story.